grows quiet, let your thoughts sail away. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. When history stops whispering and simply breathes. History is not mysterious in the way people like to believe. It does not hide secrets behind locked doors or speak in riddles meant to confuse the living. History is quieter than that, slower, more tired. It does not enjoy being misunderstood, but it has learned to tolerate it. For centuries, people have leaned too close to the past, squinting, imagining shapes in the dark, mistaking exhaustion for magic and coincidence for intention. Most historical mysteries were never designed to be mysterious. They were created accidentally by missing information, by fear filling empty spaces, by imagination working overtime while knowledge took a long nap. When science had not yet arrived, storytelling stepped in to keep people comfortable. And comfort, as it turns out, is far more persuasive than accuracy. Late at night, when attention softens and urgency fades, history finally sounds like itself. Not dramatic, not prophetic, just human. Ordinary people walking too far, eating too little, misunderstanding what they saw, and explaining it the only way they could. Not because they were foolish, but because they were doing their best with what they had. This is not a story about secrets being revealed. It is a story about volume being lowered. When the noise of legend is turned down, the past does not disappear. It becomes gentler, more believable, less impressive perhaps, but far more trustworthy. History does not demand awe. It asks for patience. Tonight is an invitation to stop chasing mystery and start listening to fatigue. To see the medieval world not as a theater of hidden forces, but as a landscape shaped by weather, hunger, confusion, and long days that never quite ended on time. The past, once stripped of drama, becomes something you can finally rest beside without fear of missing anything important. How mysteries are born when facts are tired. The idea that history is filled with unsolved mysteries says more about modern expectations than about the past itself. We assume that if something feels strange, it must be intentionally hidden. If an explanation is missing, we assume it was stolen, suppressed, or buried by someone important. But most of the time, the explanation simply never existed in the first place. In medieval Europe, information moved slowly, unevenly, and often incorrectly. News traveled by rumor, memory, and repetition. Details softened with distance. Causes blurred into symbols. When people encountered something unfamiliar, they reached for meaning instead of measurement. It was not superstition so much as improvisation. Without tools, they used stories. Without data, they used instinct. Science, when it finally arrived, did not destroy history's mysteries. It revealed how small they actually were. Skeletons once thought cursed turned out to belong to travelers who walked too far. Cities said to vanish overnight were simply built in the wrong places. Strange behavior explained by invisible forces traced back to hunger, stress, or bad bread. The past was not hiding anything. It was struggling. What we call mystery is often just delayed understanding. The medieval world lacked shared records, consistent measurement, and reliable preservation. Time erased what people did not know how to protect. Later generations filled the gaps with imagination because silence feels uncomfortable. A blank space invites a story, and stories tend to grow louder the longer they are repeated. Looking back with modern tools does not make the past smaller, it makes it clearer. When legends are removed, something quieter remains. People who were tired, societies stretched thin, communities responding imperfectly to forces they could not control. The medieval world was not enchanted, it was overwhelmed. This perspective does not make history boring, it makes it intimate. It replaces spectacle with proximity. When mystery dissolves, empathy appears. You begin to recognize patterns that feel uncomfortably familiar. Fear becomes rumor. Rumor becomes tradition. Tradition hardens into belief. And belief, once written down, pretends it was always true. The goal here is not to correct the past, but to slow down how we look at it, to let explanations breathe, to allow the medieval world to be uncertain without turning that uncertainty into magic. When we stop demanding that history impress us, it finally feels honest enough to sit beside in silence. When science arrives late but stays quiet. Between the 11th and 16th centuries, Europe existed in a long state of transition, not moving forward quickly, not standing still either. Knowledge accumulated unevenly, passed through hands that changed it without realizing. Understanding came in fragments, often separated by generations. When explanations failed, imagination stepped in as a placeholder, never expecting to be permanent. Modern science does not arrive like a hero. It enters gently, centuries late, apologizing for the delay. It looks at bones, soil, weather patterns, and handwriting. It listens instead of declaring, and what it finds is rarely exciting. The answers are practical, sometimes disappointing, occasionally even funny. A mystery collapses into logistics. A legend dissolves into malnutrition. This does not strip history of meaning. It returns meaning to the correct scale. The medieval period was not defined by hidden knowledge, but by limited access to it. People interpreted the world using what they could feel, see, and remember. When those tools failed, they adapted. Not always gracefully, but persistently. The unsettling part is not how wrong they were. It is how reasonable their explanations seemed at the time. With no context, no comparison, no confirmation, imagination becomes a survival skill. It fills silence. It offers comfort. It explains suffering without demanding proof. And once shared, it becomes social glue. Science does not mock these stories. It simply outgrows them, slowly, carefully, without raising its voice. It replaces mystery with mechanisms, not to humiliate the past, but to understand it. And in doing so, it reveals something far more interesting than secrets. It reveals continuity. The medieval world was not alien. It was earlier. The same patterns of misunderstanding appear again and again across centuries, across cultures. Fear dressed as certainty, explanation mistaken for truth, and always the quiet presence of ordinary life underneath. When we view history this way, it stops demanding attention, it stops shouting, it lies down, exhales, and becomes something you can listen to without effort. Something that does not need belief, only observation. When the past finally rests, history does not whisper secrets, it sighs, long, slow human sighs, carried across time. When the stories are softened and the myths set aside, what remains is not emptiness but calm. A record of people doing what they could with what they had, and leaving behind traces that only seem mysterious when we expect them to be clever. The medieval world was not built to confuse us. It simply never imagined we would be watching this closely. And perhaps that is the most soothing realization of all. Before we step fully into the heart of this story, it helps to slow down and understand what kind of silence we are entering. This is not the loud silence of unanswered questions, but the softer kind that appears when explanations are finally allowed to arrive. For a long time, history has been framed as a puzzle box, full of hidden compartments, secret meanings, and intentional obscurity. Yet most of what we call mystery was never designed, protected, or even noticed by the people living through it. The medieval world, stretching roughly from the 11th to the 16th century, existed in a state of constant adjustment. Life moved slowly, information moved unevenly, and certainty was a rare luxury. People worked, traveled, worried, ate poorly, slept lightly, and explained the world with whatever tools were available. When those tools failed, imagination stepped in, not to deceive, but to soothe. What followed were stories that lingered longer than the facts ever could. Over generations, these stories hardened into legends, and legends were treated as evidence simply because nothing else survived. Bones without names, cities without records, behaviors without context, all invited interpretation. In the absence of measurement, meaning took its place. This is where mystery thrives, not because something is hidden, but because something is missing. Modern science, arriving centuries later, does not storm these spaces with certainty. It enters quietly, asking careful questions, comparing patterns, and testing assumptions. The answers it offers are often gentle and surprisingly ordinary. A long journey explains a strange burial. Hunger explains erratic behavior. Climate explains a vanished settlement. What once felt supernatural slowly becomes logistical. This shift does not strip history of beauty. It replaces spectacle with closeness. By removing exaggerated drama, the past becomes easier to sit with. We begin to see people instead of symbols. Not heroes or villains, but individuals navigating uncertainty with limited guidance. This series of reflections belongs to medieval Europe and the early transition into the modern age. It moves through England, France, Germany, and Central Europe, following moments where confusion outlived clarity. The goal is not correction, but calm reconsideration. To notice how often mystery dissolves when we stop rushing toward it. What follows is not a revelation, but a gradual settling. An invitation to let history speak at its own pace without demanding enchantment. In this quieter space, the past becomes less mysterious and more familiar. And familiarity, gently applied, has a way of easing the mind toward rest. That is where the true comfort of history waits, not in secrets, but in understanding. And from here, we drift naturally into the stories themselves, unhurried, attentive, and finally at ease, ready to listen without needing anything more. Chapter 1. Misunderstood. Deaths. Death in the medieval world was rarely allowed to remain simple, not because it carried grand meaning, but because simplicity made people uncomfortable. A body found in the wrong place demanded explanation. Silence felt dangerous. When no story was available, one was invented, gently at first, then repeated until it sounded certain enough to believe. Over time, these inventions hardened into history. Many skeletons discovered centuries later were labeled strange almost immediately. Their positions felt wrong. Their locations seemed suspicious. A grave placed slightly apart from others invited speculation. A missing object suggested punishment. History, especially when tired, prefers narrative over restraint. It fills gaps with intention because intention feels safer than randomness. Modern science has complicated this habit in quiet ways. Bones tell stories without words. Worn joints suggest long travel. Stress marks reveal malnutrition. Chemical traces map distant origins. These details rarely support dramatic conclusions. They describe movement, effort, and gradual exhaustion. The mystery dissolves into logistics. Travel during the medieval period demanded far more than courage. It demanded bodies willing to be worn down slowly. Roads were uneven, muddy, and unreliable. Footwear offered little protection. Food was inconsistent. A long journey did not require danger to become fatal. It required only time. People collapsed, not because they were cursed, but because their bodies finally refused to continue. When such travelers died, communities responded practically. Burials were quick, rituals were minimal. The living could not afford extended ceremony. Disease was feared. Weather mattered. Survival required efficiency. These choices, sensible in their moment, appeared suspicious to later observers who no longer remembered the circumstances. Centuries removed from context, interpretation rushed in. A hurried burial became evidence of disgrace. An unfamiliar body became proof of wrongdoing. History rarely pauses to ask whether the story makes sense physically. It prefers symbolism to fatigue. Disease added another layer of misunderstanding. Many illnesses leave no trace on bones. Fevers, infections, internal failures kill efficiently without drama. To medieval witnesses, such deaths felt sudden. To later generations, they felt suspicious. To modern analysis, they feel ordinary. The dead themselves were never mysterious. The mystery was created by distance. When memory fades, imagination steps forward. It offers coherence where none exists. It assigns blame because blame explains loss more comfortably than chance. What unsettles modern listeners is not how often these interpretations were wrong, but how reasonable they once felt. Without shared knowledge or diagnostic tools, people relied on pattern and repetition. If something felt unusual often enough, it became meaningful. Truth was shaped by familiarity, not accuracy. History shows little mercy to the unlucky. Those who died quietly became symbols against their will. Their remains carried stories that belonged to fear rather than fact. Over time, silence was mistaken for guilt. Scientific reassessment does not correct these stories loudly. It replaces them gently. It listens to what the body endured rather than what people believed. Distance traveled, food consumed, stress endured. These details do not thrill, but they reassure. They restore scale. The truth is rarely exciting. It does not demand attention. It does not elevate the dead into lessons. It allows them to remain what they were, people who failed under pressure. Exhaustion, not evil, explains most of what was misunderstood. History, however, has always preferred metaphor. It transforms long journeys into exile. It turns fatigue into moral weakness. It reshapes inconvenience into meaning. These habits linger because they are emotionally satisfying, even when they are wrong. Misunderstood deaths reveal the living more clearly than the dead. They expose discomfort with uncertainty. They show how quickly humans convert accident into intention. Randomness feels unfinished. Story completes it. Once a narrative takes hold, it resists correction. Repetition grants authority. Authority becomes tradition. Tradition poses as truth. By the time evidence arrives, the story feels too familiar to question. Modern archaeology approaches these remains without expectation. It does not ask what message the death carried. It asks what the body experienced. The answers are consistently modest. Distance, cold, hunger, illness, injury, no drama required. There is comfort in this modesty. When the story shrinks, tension eases. The dead no longer accuse or warn, they simply rest. These deaths were not signs. They were endings, unplanned, unremarkable, and undesigned to survive scrutiny. The mystery was never in the bones. It lived in the space left by missing information. History becomes quieter when that space is acknowledged instead of filled. Silence stops feeling threatening. Explanation becomes optional. In that quiet, the past loses its sharp edges and becomes something gentler. When misunderstood deaths are allowed to be ordinary, they finally settle. Not as puzzles to solve, but as reminders of physical limits. Bodies fail, journeys end. Context disappears. Stories grow. And when those stories fade, sleep arrives more easily. History has always struggled with ordinary endings. A death without spectacle feels unfinished, as if something important was forgotten. In the medieval world, where life itself was physically demanding and constantly uncertain, death was common, but understanding was rare. People accepted loss, but they did not always accept randomness. When no explanation arrived, meaning was applied carefully, then forcefully, then permanently. Many remains that puzzled later generations were once handled without hesitation. A body found by the roadside was not debated. It was dealt with, dug into the earth, covered, left behind. The living did not linger. They could not afford to. Hunger waited, weather waited, work waited. Survival was not sentimental. Centuries later, scholars approached these same graves with different expectations. They expected intention. They expected symbolism. They expected the dead to tell a story worth preserving. When the remains failed to cooperate, suspicion followed. A practical decision made under pressure became evidence of disgrace. History mistook urgency for secrecy. This pattern appears again and again. A burial that lacked care was assumed to reflect judgment. A grave placed away from others was assumed to mark rejection. Bones found near borders were assumed to belong to exiles. But borders were porous. People moved constantly. Trade, labor, migration, and necessity pushed bodies across regions long before records existed to track them. The medieval world was mobile, just not documented. Travel left marks on joints and teeth, not on paper. When those marks were later discovered, they were interpreted through imagination rather than physiology. Science offered a quieter explanation. Stress fractures spoke of repetitive movement. Joint erosion spoke of long distances walked slowly. Chemical signatures spoke of unfamiliar water and food. None of this suggested punishment. It suggested endurance. The irony is that endurance rarely survives memory. Drama does. A tired body collapsing near a destination feels anticlimactic. A cursed traveler feels significant. History prefers significance. Disease reinforced this habit. Many medieval illnesses killed without warning. No visible wound, no external trauma. Death arrived quickly, leaving witnesses confused. Confusion invited speculation. Speculation hardened into explanation. By the time bones were rediscovered, the original uncertainty had already transformed into myth. What modern listeners find unsettling is not how wrong these stories were, but how emotionally effective they remain. Blame comforts. It organizes loss. It suggests control. Random failure offers nothing in return. So history leaned toward blame, and it stayed there. Misunderstood deaths became moral shorthand. They warned against travel, against disobedience, against deviation. They were used to reinforce order, even when order had nothing to do with the event itself. The dead were recruited into lessons they never consented to teach. Science does not undo these lessons aggressively. It simply withdraws them. It offers smaller explanations, less satisfying ones, but also kinder ones. A person walked too far. A body failed under strain. A fever ended something quietly. These explanations do not elevate the dead. They humanize them. There is something deeply calming about that. When meaning shrinks, tension fades. The dead stop performing. They no longer carry accusations or warnings. They rest as bodies that reached their limits. History becomes gentler when it allows this rest. The medieval world was not filled with secret judgments. It was filled with physical boundaries. Hunger, cold, illness, distance. These forces shaped lives far more than moral narratives ever did. But moral narratives survived longer because they were easier to remember. Modern archaeology listens differently. It does not ask what the death meant. It asks what the body endured. This shift changes everything. It removes drama. It removes fear. It replaces speculation with quiet certainty. And quiet certainty, unlike legend, does not keep people awake. Once misunderstood deaths are allowed to remain simple, they lose their grip. They stop asking questions. They stop demanding interpretation. They become what they always were, endings that occurred without instruction. History, relieved of the need to explain them, finally relaxes. And in that relaxation, the past becomes something you can drift alongside. Not something to solve, not something to fear, just a record of bodies moving through difficult conditions until they could not move anymore. That realization does not diminish the past. It softens it. And softened history, stripped of accusation and spectacle, has a way of settling the mind. There is a particular kind of injustice in how history remembers exhaustion. It rarely calls it what it is. Fatigue becomes failure. Collapse becomes guilt. A body that stops moving is assumed to have made a mistake. The medieval world did not document tiredness well, and later centuries were even worse at recognizing it. Many of the dead were not dramatic figures. They were people who underestimated distance, overestimated strength, or simply kept walking because stopping felt worse than continuing. Long journeys did not end in moments of heroism. They ended quietly, often within sight of shelter, a town, a churchyard, a crossroads, places close enough to suggest intention, yet far enough to deny survival. When these bodies were found, the response was immediate and practical. Someone dug, someone covered, someone moved on. No one lingered to imagine future interpretations. They were busy staying alive, History, however, lingered extensively. Centuries later, interpretation arrived with confidence. It spoke loudly over absence. It declared meaning where none was intended. A body near a boundary was declared an outcast. A grave without care was declared a warning. Silence was mistaken for secrecy. The medieval world did not think in metaphors as often as later historians assumed. It thought in necessities: warmth, food, time, safety. When someone died, the priority was not symbolism. It was containment. Disease was feared. Corpses were handled quickly because speed reduced risk. Efficiency was survival, not judgment. But efficiency ages poorly. Without explanation, it looks cruel. Without context, it looks deliberate. History rarely forgives missing context. What modern investigation reveals again and again is that most of these deaths required no interpretation at all. The body explains itself when listened to carefully. Bones remember strain. Teeth remember hunger. Chemistry remembers geography. These memories do not align with the stories once told. The gap between what happened and what was remembered is not malicious. It is structural. Human memory favors coherence. It favors lessons. It favors endings that make sense. A person who dies because their body fails feels incomplete. A person who dies because they broke a rule feels resolved. So rules were invented. The dead became examples rather than individuals. They were used to reinforce order even when order had nothing to do with their lives. Their stories were simplified until they fit comfortably into belief. Science disrupts this comfort quietly. It does not argue. It does not accuse. It replaces explanation with evidence and allows the evidence to remain unimpressive. That is its strength. An unimpressive truth is restful. There is no warning hidden in these bones, no message carved into posture, no secret encoded in location, just bodies that reached limits. When this is accepted, history loosens its grip. The dead no longer need to justify themselves. They stop carrying the weight of later imagination. They become what they always were: people whose stories ended without commentary. This understanding does not remove sadness, it changes its texture. Instead of tragedy shaped by meaning, there is loss shaped by circumstance. That loss is quieter. It does not demand attention. It does not insist on resolution. And that quiet is important. In the stillness of late-night listening, it becomes possible to hear history without effort, not as a series of mysteries, but as a record of physical realities. Bodies walked, bodies weakened, bodies stopped. Everything else came later. Misunderstood deaths lose their power when they are allowed to remain ordinary. They stop being puzzles and start being moments. Moments that ended, not because they needed to teach something, but because bodies are finite. History rarely admits this willingly. It prefers stories that feel purposeful. But purpose is a luxury of distance. Those who lived through these endings did not have it. They had weather. They had hunger. They had tired legs and unreliable roads. And sometimes that was enough to end everything. When we stop demanding more than that, history becomes calm. It stops accusing. It stops explaining. It rests. And in that rest, the mind follows. The past no longer stands upright, asking to be understood. It lies down, unremarkable, and finally, allowed to sleep. As the stories fade, what remains is not revelation, but relief. Relief from expectation. Relief from meaning forced where none was needed. The dead no longer stand accused by silence. They are no longer required to explain themselves to the living. They simply are what they always were. Bodies that reached an end. History often treats these endings as unfinished sentences, as if something important was left unsaid. But perhaps nothing was missing. Perhaps the discomfort came not from mystery, but from our refusal to accept simplicity. A life ending because it could no longer continue feels unsatisfying. It offers no moral, no instruction, no warning. It just stops. The medieval world was full of such stops, quiet ones, unnoticed ones. People fell ill, grew weak, collapsed, and were gone before anyone thought to record why. Those who remained moved on quickly because lingering was dangerous. Food spoiled. Weather shifted. Survival demanded attention. Later generations, spared those immediate pressures, had the luxury of interpretation. They looked back and saw absence where context once existed. They filled that absence with meaning because meaning felt necessary. Over time, the stories grew heavier than the lives they described. Modern understanding does not strip these deaths of dignity. It returns dignity to the correct place, not in legend, but in limitation. Bodies have thresholds. When crossed, they fail. This is not tragedy shaped by destiny. It is reality shaped by physics. There is something deeply calming in accepting this. When death is allowed to be ordinary, fear loosens. The past stops staring back, demanding explanation. It turns away, uninterested in judgment, content to remain incomplete. Misunderstood deaths teach nothing on purpose. Any lesson drawn from them belongs to the living, not the dead. The people who died on roads, near towns, or far from home were not symbols. They were individuals whose strength ran out quietly. History becomes kinder when it admits this. It stops using the dead as tools. It stops turning fatigue into failure. It allows endings to remain endings without commentary. In the quiet of night, this kindness matters. It removes tension from listening. The past no longer asks to be solved. It invites rest instead. The mind, no longer hunting for hidden meaning, slows naturally. Bodies moved through difficult landscapes until they could not. That is all. Everything else was added later. And with that understanding, the chapter settles, not with resolution, but with stillness. The dead are no longer mysterious. They are no longer misunderstood. They are simply allowed to rest, and in their rest, history finally becomes quiet enough to let sleep arrive. Chapter 2. When famous people went missing in the wrong places. Fame, as it turns out, is remarkably fragile once a body is involved. In life, a name can travel far. In death, it often stops abruptly, usually somewhere inconvenient. The medieval world was not designed to preserve reputations neatly. It was chaotic, violent, administratively careless, and deeply uninterested in the comfort of future historians. Many well-known figures did not disappear because someone wanted them erased. They vanished because no one had time to care properly. Battles were loud, confused, and fast. Retreats happened in panic. Bodies were gathered quickly, if at all. The priority was survival, not legacy. A famous name did not come with instructions attached. When wars ended, landscapes were often unrecognizable. Fields were trampled, towns burned, graves were shallow and temporary, records were lost, destroyed, or never written. It is difficult to preserve identity when the ground itself is unstable. And so, many people who mattered deeply in life became anonymous almost immediately after death. History later struggled with this anonymity. If someone important could not be found, suspicion followed. Perhaps they were hidden. Perhaps their enemies intervened. Perhaps something deliberate occurred. The absence of remains felt like a mystery that required explanation. Conspiracy sounded more satisfying than disorder. But disorder was the default condition. Medieval warfare produced confusion at a scale that modern audiences rarely appreciate. Communication failed constantly. Armies scattered. Command structures collapsed. Even victories ended messily. Dead bodies were stripped, moved, buried without markers, or left where they fell. Identifying individuals was often impossible, especially when armor and clothing were removed quickly. Burial was pragmatic, not symbolic. Mass graves solved immediate problems. Unmarked pits prevented disease. Documentation was optional. A famous person lying among hundreds of others did not receive special treatment unless someone recognized them in time. And recognition was unreliable. Faces were damaged. Time passed quickly. The moment was lost. Centuries later, the disappearance of these figures became a problem for historians, not for the people who lived through the events. To them, the chaos made sense. To us, the silence feels intentional. Modern science has entered this silence gently. DNA analysis, osteology, and archaeological context now provide tools that reputation never did. Bones can be compared, lineages traced, injuries matched to historical accounts. The work is slow and unspectacular, but it produces something powerful. Placement. Placement does not mean glory, it means accuracy. One of the most unsettling discoveries modern archaeology has made is how little status protects the dead. Kings, nobles, commanders, and celebrated leaders were subject to the same forces as everyone else. Panic did not pause for importance. Mud did not recognize titles. Time erased distinctions efficiently. Sometimes the final resting place of a famous person ended up beneath roads, buildings, or car parks. Not because of disrespect, but because cities grew without consulting the dead. Structures replaced structures. Memory was overwritten by necessity. The ground kept its secrets until someone asked the right questions. There is a strange humor in this. Not mockery, but irony. History loves to imagine itself as intentional, yet some of its most dramatic corrections occur in the least dramatic locations. A parking lot, a forgotten foundation, an unremarkable patch of earth, places where no one expected to find anything meaningful. Science does not restore these figures to myth. It restores them to scale. A famous person becomes a body again, measured, analyzed, located. Their story does not become larger. It becomes more precise. And precision is quieter than legend. What these discoveries reveal is not conspiracy but neglect. Paper decays, buildings fall, cities expand, memory shifts. The disappearance of famous people often reflects nothing more than administrative failure and historical impatience. We prefer to imagine that someone important could not simply vanish, that there must have been intention. But intention requires coordination, and coordination was rare. Chaos does not need planning. It produces absence effortlessly. The act of rediscovery does not rewrite history. It corrects it softly. DNA does not argue, it confirms. Archaeology does not accuse, it contextualizes. The past adjusts without drama. There is comfort in knowing that fame does not guarantee preservation. It reminds us that history is not curated by importance, but shaped by circumstance. Those who were remembered did not always deserve it. Those who were forgotten were not always insignificant. When science returns a name to a body, it does not elevate the dead. It grounds them. It places them back into the human story where they always belonged. Not above it, not beyond it. The medieval world did not lose these people on purpose. It simply moved on. And moving on is something history does exceptionally well. In late-night listening, this realization feels oddly calming. The past stops performing. It admits carelessness. It admits limits. It admits that even the famous are subject to the same ending as everyone else. No monument prevents burial mistakes. No reputation resists time. No glory survives bad record keeping. And sometimes the truth waits quietly beneath the most ordinary places, patient enough to be rediscovered only when no one is looking for drama anymore. That patience is the opposite of conspiracy. It is the natural rhythm of history settling. When famous people disappear, it is rarely because someone planned it well. It is because no one planned anything at all. There is also something revealing in how long it took to look for them properly. For centuries, the absence of famous remains was treated as an intellectual puzzle, not a physical one. Scholars debated motives, politics, betrayals, and secret burials, without ever considering the simplest explanation. The ground had never been asked carefully enough. History preferred paperwork to soil, names to bones, texts to bodies. But texts lie easily when they are incomplete. Bones, on the other hand, are patient. They wait without exaggeration. They do not invent motives. They simply remain where they were placed, even if no one remembers why. When archaeology finally intervenes, it does so without reverence. It measures, catalogs, compares. It treats kings and common soldiers with the same indifference. This is not disrespect. It is fairness. The unsettling part is how often this fairness contradicts tradition. A hero expected to lie in splendor is found alone. A ruler believed to rest in honor is discovered beneath later construction. A famous death remembered vividly turns out to have been followed by a remarkably careless burial. The medieval world did not stage endings. It survived them. Battlefields were cleared with urgency, not ceremony. The living needed space, supplies, and movement. The dead were obstacles first, memories later. When burial happened, it happened fast. Shallow graves were not insults. They were solutions. Documentation, when it existed at all, was inconsistent. Names were misspelled, dates conflicted, locations shifted. Over time, the paper trail became thinner than the soil above the remains, and then centuries passed. Cities expanded, roads were built, foundations laid, entire populations moved without realizing what lay beneath them. The famous and the forgotten blended into the same layers. Earth does not categorize. When modern science finally identifies someone long missing, The moment is quieter than expected. There is no dramatic reveal for the bones themselves. The drama belongs entirely to the living who suddenly realize how wrong they were. It is not shocking that a famous person was lost. It is shocking that we ever expected otherwise. The idea that importance guarantees careful remembrance is a modern illusion. Medieval systems were not designed for legacy management. They were designed to keep people fed, defended, and moving. Once someone died, their usefulness to the system ended abruptly. Science restores these figures not to grandeur, but to geography. It answers the question where, not why. And that distinction matters. The why invites speculation. The where invites rest. There is also a subtle humility in these discoveries. They remind us that history does not preserve people because they mattered. It preserves people because circumstances allowed it. Survival, even in memory, is conditional. Fame does not stop erosion. Titles do not prevent forgetting. And being known does not mean being carefully handled. In this way, the rediscovery of famous individuals feels less like triumph and more like correction, a gentle adjustment, a quiet acknowledgement that the past was messier than our stories allowed. Late at night, this messiness feels oddly soothing. It removes pressure. It tells us that even history did not have a plan, that chaos was normal, that confusion was not failure. When we imagine famous figures disappearing into the wrong places, it stops feeling scandalous. It starts feeling human. They were caught in the same systems, the same limitations, the same rushed decisions as everyone else. Their disappearance was not a mystery waiting to be solved. It was an inconvenience waiting to be noticed. And now, slowly, carefully, without spectacle, science notices. The bones are returned to context. The names are returned to bodies. The stories are returned to scale, not larger, smaller, truer. And in that truth, history exhales. The famous are no longer hovering somewhere undefined, suspended in rumor. They are grounded, located, placed gently back into the earth where they always belonged, whether that earth lies beneath stone, soil, or something as unromantic as a stretch of asphalt. Hao Kuang, it turns out, does not bend geology, and memory without evidence drifts easily. Science does not resurrect the past. It simply puts it back where it fell. And that, quietly, is enough. In the end, the most unsettling truth about missing famous people is not where they were found, but how little their absence mattered at the time. History did not pause, wars continued, cities rebuilt, new names replaced old ones. The world did what it always does best. It moved forward without waiting for closure. The idea that someone important must be remembered carefully is a story we tell ourselves after the fact. It comforts us. It suggests order, but the medieval past offers little evidence for such care. Importance was temporary. Survival was immediate. Memory was fragile. When science steps in centuries later, it does not correct an injustice so much as reveal indifference. No one conspired to erase these people. They were simply overtaken by events larger than any single life. Paper failed. Witnesses died. Landscapes changed. And then the ground forgot nothing. There is something almost gentle in how this forgetting works. The earth does not judge status, it does not preserve hierarchies, it holds bodies until someone asks the right questions in the right way. Until then, everything remains equal. This is why rediscovery feels less triumphant than expected. The excitement fades quickly, replaced by a strange calm. The famous dead are no longer dramatic figures, lost to intrigue. They are measured, catalogued, and quietly returned to context. Their stories shrink, and that shrinking feels honest. A missing king is no longer a riddle. A lost commander is no longer a legend. They become people who died during unstable times and were buried quickly by tired hands. The irony, of course, is unavoidable. The lives that once commanded attention end beneath places designed for convenience. Roads, buildings, parking lots, spaces meant for movement, not memory. But this irony is not cruel. It is consistent. Modern life builds on old ground constantly. We do it without malice, without awareness. History is not buried out of spite. It is buried because space is needed. Science, when it uncovers these remains, does not scold the past. It listens to it, and the past answers plainly. No secret plots, no dramatic erasures, just rushed decisions made under pressure. This understanding changes how we listen to history at night. The tension drains away. The need for mystery dissolves. The famous are no longer hovering, unresolved. They are placed, settled, finished, and once finished, they no longer demand attention. Hao Kuang does not follow the body underground. Titles do not echo in soil. Only matter remains. When famous people vanish into the wrong places, it is not because history failed them. It is because history never promised anything in the first place. That promise was invented later. Science removes the promise gently, replacing it with location, evidence, and quiet acceptance. The past becomes less theatrical, more human, and much easier to sit with. As the chapter closes, nothing dramatic happens. There is no revelation that changes everything. There is only the soft realization that even the most celebrated lives end the same way, unnoticed, misfiled, and eventually forgotten until someone cares enough to look. And once found, they do not rise. They rest. Placed correctly at last, not above history, not beneath it, but within it. Ordinary, finite, and finally still. That stillness is where this chapter ends. Chapter 3. Texts that were revered. A little too much. There is a particular kind of reverence reserved for old writing. Ink fades, parchment yellows, handwriting becomes difficult, and suddenly difficulty turns into importance. If something is hard to read, people assume it must be profound. If meaning is unclear, imagination steps in to help. Many medieval manuscripts survived not because they were extraordinary, but because they were useful enough to be copied, stored, and carried forward. Over time, usefulness was mistaken for insight. Age was confused with wisdom. Obscurity became evidence of depth. And so ordinary notes were promoted to cosmic significance. A list of herbs became a secret medical code. A calendar became an astronomical prophecy. A collection of household remedies became a philosophical system. None of this happened on purpose. It happened slowly, quietly, and with great confidence. The medieval world wrote constantly. Not elegantly, not consistently, but constantly. People wrote to remember what worked, what failed, what should not be repeated. They wrote to keep track of days, treatments, diets, weather patterns, bodily complaints, and practical routines. Writing was not performance. It was memory support. The problem came later when readers encountered these texts without context, without familiarity, without the assumptions that once made everything obvious. What had been common knowledge became strange. What had been shorthand became mysterious. And mystery is irresistible. Modern readers often approach the past expecting revelation. They want ancestors to have known something we forgot, something hidden, something powerful. It is comforting to imagine that history holds answers rather than records. But most manuscripts do not answer questions. They document habits. They record what people ate when sick, what they avoided during certain seasons, what worked sometimes, and what probably did not. The language is often unclear because clarity was never the goal. The writer knew what they meant. They did not expect strangers centuries later to read it. These were private systems of understanding, not messages to the future. When modern analysis applies linguistic study, chemical testing, and contextual comparison, the result is rarely dramatic. The great mysteries collapse into mundane reality. The cosmic symbols turn out to be shorthand. The encrypted alphabets reveal phonetic spelling. The sacred diagrams become instructional sketches. It is not disappointing. It is grounding. The human tendency to overestimate the past is persistent. We assume earlier societies were closer to truth because they were closer to origin. But proximity to origin does not guarantee clarity. It often guarantees confusion. Medieval writers worked without standardization. Spelling varied. Grammar wandered. Symbols were reused carelessly. A single mark could mean different things in different regions. Consistency was rare. Interpretation required familiarity, not genius. When that familiarity was lost, meaning followed. This loss created space for fantasy, and fantasy filled the gaps eagerly. Entire theories were built around texts that were never meant to carry theory. Scholars debated intentions that never existed. Books were elevated to philosophical status simply because no one could explain them easily. Science approaches these texts differently. It does not ask what they might mean. It asks how they were used, where they were stored, who copied them, what materials were involved, how often they were referenced. These questions lead to quieter conclusions. A manuscript found alongside household items likely belonged to daily life. A book copied repeatedly with small variations suggests practical use, not sacred secrecy. Marginal notes reveal frustration, boredom, or personal preference far more often than revelation. One of the most revealing discoveries is how often medieval readers corrected their texts. They crossed things out, added notes, changed instructions. This was not reverence, it was pragmatism. They did not worship their books. They argued with them. The illusion of sacredness often comes from later treatment. When a text is preserved carefully, locked away, and discussed in hushed tones, it gains authority. But that authority is imposed, not inherent. People assume that survival equals significance. In reality, survival often equals luck. Fires destroyed libraries. Wars erased collections. The texts that remain are not necessarily the best. They are the ones that avoided disaster. When modern readers treat these survivors as special, they project intention onto accident. The idea that the past knew more than the present is appealing. It suggests decline rather than progress. It comforts anxiety, but it ignores evidence. The past struggled with the same uncertainty, only with fewer tools. Their notes reflect that struggle. Hesitation appears in margins. Doubt is implied in repetition. Contradictions are common. What we call mystical ambiguity is often just indecision. Late at night, this realization feels calming. The pressure lifts, the past stops being an oracle, it becomes a neighbor, someone who wrote things down because memory failed and clarity mattered in the moment. When the aura of sacredness dissolves, something better replaces it: intimacy. These texts feel closer, not grander. They reveal hands, habits, impatience, and practical concern. Someone wrote this while tired. Someone reused symbols because it was faster. Someone assumed they would remember what this meant later. They did not, and that is where mystery begins. Modern analysis does not strip meaning from these texts. It relocates meaning from cosmic intention to human routine, from prophecy to practice. This shift is unsettling only if we expected grandeur. If we accept ordinariness, it is peaceful. The past did not hide secrets from us. It left notes for itself. And those notes, messy and inconsistent, were never meant to impress. They were meant to help someone get through the day. As the chapter settles, the manuscripts lose their glow, not because they are unimportant, but because they no longer need to perform. They rest as records of effort, not insight, of routine, not revelation. And in that rest, history becomes quieter, more believable, and much easier to listen to without needing to understand everything at once. The past did not speak in riddles. It wrote in reminders. We only forgot how ordinary those reminders were. What is often overlooked is how deeply inconvenient medieval writing actually was. Ink smeared, pages tore, abbreviations multiplied without warning. Writers assumed familiarity, shared background, and a level of patience that modern readers rarely possess. When we encounter these texts now, frustration masquerades as awe. Difficulty becomes depth, because it feels more dignified than admitting confusion. Many manuscripts look cryptic simply because they were written quickly. Time mattered, light was limited, materials were expensive, efficiency shaped language more than elegance ever did. Shortcuts replaced clarity, symbols replaced words, entire ideas were compressed into marks that made sense only to the person holding the pen. This was not secrecy. It was practicality. Modern fascination often begins when meaning slips out of reach. A page that refuses to explain itself invites speculation. People lean toward cosmic answers because ordinary ones feel anticlimactic. No one wants to believe that centuries of debate might revolve around a list of remedies for stomach discomfort or seasonal advice on avoiding damp air. But analysis insists gently. Chemical tests reveal ink composition consistent with domestic use. Wear patterns show pages frequently opened, not ceremonially preserved. Margins contain complaints, corrections, even jokes. These are not the habits of people guarding universal truths. These are the habits of people trying to remember what worked last winter. The belief that the past encoded wisdom beyond our reach says more about modern anxiety than medieval intention. We are uncomfortable with the idea that history is not layered with hidden brilliance. We prefer ancestors who knew something essential we lost, rather than people who coped imperfectly with limited information. Yet the texts themselves resist this fantasy. They contradict one another freely. They repeat instructions inconsistently. They offer options rather than conclusions. This is not the voice of certainty. It is the voice of trial and error. When linguistic patterns are mapped across regions, clarity emerges slowly. What once seemed like encrypted language reveals dialect shifts. What appeared symbolic resolves into regional shorthand. What was treated as deliberate obscurity turns out to be casual inconsistency. Nothing mystical survives scrutiny, but something gentler does. Humanity, the recognition that people wrote things down because memory failed, not because destiny demanded documentation. They were not leaving messages for us. They were leaving reminders for themselves. At night, this realization feels strangely comforting. The past stops looming. It sits down beside us, equally unsure, equally prone to messiness. The manuscripts no longer ask to be decoded. They ask to be understood within limits. Understanding here does not mean translation alone. It means restraint. The willingness to accept that a text can be important without being profound, useful without being universal, significant without being secret. The elevation of these writings says less about their content than about our hunger for meaning. We want the past to justify itself. We want complexity to signal superiority. But complexity often signals nothing more than accumulated habit. In the end, these texts teach a quieter lesson. That knowledge was always provisional. That certainty was rare. That writing was a tool, not a revelation. When we stop demanding transcendence, the manuscripts relax. They no longer glow with false authority. They settle into their proper place as artifacts of daily life. Someone wrote this to remember. Someone else copied it because it seemed helpful. Someone later struggled to read it and assumed brilliance where there was only haste. That chain of misunderstanding grew slowly, patiently, until myth replaced context. Science reverses that process without drama. It does not accuse the past of ignorance. It simply restores proportion. And proportion, once restored, allows the mind to rest. The past did not whisper secrets, it scribbled notes. And those notes, when allowed to remain ordinary, finally become quiet enough to listen to without effort, without reverence, and without the need to solve anything at all. As this chapter settles, what remains is not disappointment, but adjustment. The past does not shrink when its texts lose their mystical glow. It becomes clearer, more stable, less demanding. These manuscripts stop asking to be admired and start allowing themselves to be understood as they were always meant to be understood, as working tools made by tired hands in imperfect conditions. There is a quiet relief in realizing that history did not spend its days encoding cosmic truths for future generations to unlock. People were busy managing discomfort, illness, weather, and routine. They wrote things down not to impress, but to cope. The mystery was never intentional. It emerged only when context vanished and patience thinned. When modern analysis removes the layers of reverence, nothing valuable is lost. What disappears is excess imagination. What remains is intimacy, a closeness to ordinary lives that no grand theory could ever provide. These texts feel warmer once they stop being elevated beyond their purpose. The urge to worship difficulty fades. Hard-to-read handwriting no longer signals enlightenment. Inconsistent symbols no longer suggest secret knowledge. They simply reflect a world without standardization, where meaning lived in shared experience rather than formal structure. Late at night, this understanding fits naturally. It asks nothing of the listener. There is no puzzle to solve, no hidden message to uncover. The mind is free to drift, knowing that the past was not waiting for us to catch up. It was moving forward blindly, just as we are now. History becomes quieter when we stop asking it to perform. The manuscripts rest when they are no longer burdened with expectation. They no longer need to justify their survival with grandeur. Their value lies in their honesty. Someone once wrote these words quickly, trusting memory to fill the gaps. Someone else struggled to read them centuries later and mistook effort for depth. Now, gently, that misunderstanding dissolves. The past does not need to be wiser than the present to matter. It only needs to be real. And with that realization, this chapter closes softly. The texts return to silence. Not sacred, not secret, simply human. Chapter 4, Children, Others, and the Weight of Collective Imagination. There are few things more unsettling to a society than a child who does not fit its expectations. Adults can be dismissed as sinners, criminals, or failures of character. Children, however, demand explanation. When a child appears different, fragile, unfamiliar, or difficult to understand, the discomfort spreads quickly. And when knowledge is limited, imagination steps in to restore order. Many of the stories that later became legends about strange children, inhuman beings, or others did not begin with wonder. They began with hunger, with migration, with illness, with bodies shaped by stress rather than destiny. But history rarely preserved those beginnings. It preserved the reactions instead. In medieval and early modern Europe, biology was not a language people possessed. Growth patterns were poorly understood. Nutritional deficiency was common. Genetic variation existed without vocabulary. When bodies behaved unexpectedly, society did not ask how. It asked what? And the answers were rarely kind. Children arriving from elsewhere carried visible markers of displacement, different accents, different clothing, different skin tones shaped by diet or disease. Communities accustomed to sameness interpreted difference as origin. If a child spoke strangely, they must come from elsewhere. If they looked unwell, they must belong to something unnatural. Poverty left marks that were mistaken for mystery. Chronic malnutrition altered skin color, posture, energy levels. Rickets curved bones. Anemia dulled faces. Parasitic infections changed weight and behavior. None of this was hidden. It was simply misunderstood. Without a framework for physiology, stories became explanatory tools. A child who refused certain foods was said to be unnatural rather than sick. A child who did not speak was described as otherworldly rather than traumatized. Silence became evidence. Weakness became origin. Migration intensified this process. Medieval Europe was not static, despite popular imagination. People moved constantly because they had to. War, famine, labor demand, and political pressure pushed families across regions. Children were separated, orphaned, absorbed into unfamiliar communities. To the receiving villages, these children arrived without context, no records, no explanations, no shared memory. They were present but unreadable, and unreadable things invite narrative. The collective imagination did not invent these stories out of cruelty alone. It did so out of necessity. Humans require coherence. When facts are missing, stories fill the gap. These stories stabilized fear by giving it shape. If the child was not like us, then they were from somewhere else. If they were from somewhere else, then we did not cause their suffering. If we did not cause it, then we were safe. This logic protected communities psychologically, even as it erased individuals. Illness further blurred perception. Epilepsy, developmental disorders, congenital differences, and infectious diseases were visible but unnamed. Symptoms appeared and disappeared without pattern. Bodies behaved unpredictably. In such an environment, creativity replaced diagnosis. A seizure became possession. A growth disorder became a curse. A neurological condition became proof of non-human origin. Children bore the weight of these interpretations because they lacked authority to resist them. Adults could argue, children could only be described. Over time, repeated descriptions hardened into tradition. What began as confusion became folklore. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, each repetition smoothing uncertainty into certainty. Details grew sharper as reality faded. The original child disappeared from the narrative. The symbol remained. History often records the symbol, not the person. Modern science approaches these stories carefully, not to mock them, but to re-anchor them. Skeletal analysis reveals malnutrition. Dental evidence shows long-term deprivation. Genetic markers explain physical traits once labeled monstrous. Linguistic study traces accents to migration routes. The conclusions are rarely exciting, and that is precisely their power. There is no lost race, no hidden species, no supernatural intervention. There is hunger, stress, disease, movement. The transformation from child to legend required only misunderstanding and time. What is unsettling is how easily this transformation occurred. Communities did not need malice, they needed ignorance and fear. Once a story made fear manageable, it was preserved. Children labeled as other were rarely treated with cruelty in dramatic ways. More often they were observed, discussed, and quietly separated. Distance replaced violence. Difference became entertainment or warning rather than concern. The past did not always persecute. Sometimes it simply watched. And watching without understanding can be just as damaging. Late at night, this realization carries a particular weight. The legends lose their brightness. They dim into human outlines. A child standing awkwardly, a body struggling to adapt, a voice misunderstood. The imagination that once colored these stories now feels heavy. It reveals how quickly suffering can be repurposed into meaning, how easily victims are converted into explanations. History did not turn these children into legends because they were extraordinary. It did so because it lacked tools to recognize the ordinary causes of difference. Science does not erase the sadness of these stories. It redistributes it correctly, away from myth, back onto circumstance. The truth is less colorful, but it is steadier. It does not ask us to marvel. It asks us to notice. Bodies respond to scarcity. Minds respond to trauma. Communities respond to uncertainty. None of this requires mystery, and yet mystery flourished. The collective imagination did what it always does when faced with discomfort. It made stories that were easier to remember than facts, easier to repeat than explanations, easier to live with than responsibility. As this chapter drifts toward its end, the legends soften. They no longer demand belief. They reveal function. They show us not strange children, but ordinary vulnerability refracted through fear. The past did not invent monsters. It misunderstood people. And when that misunderstanding is finally acknowledged, something quiet happens. The stories lose their sharp edges. The children step out of the shadows of legend and return gently to the category they never left: human. That simplicity is unsettling only if we expected something else. For those willing to listen slowly, it is calming. The imagination relaxes when it no longer has to explain difference with fantasy. The truth may be less vivid, but it is truer. And in the stillness of late-night history, truth does not need decoration to be heard. What lingers longest from these stories is not the strangeness itself, but how quickly it became shared. Once a community agreed on an explanation, it settled into place like furniture that no one remembered choosing. The explanation did not need to be correct. It only needed to be repeatable. Over time, repetition became truth, and truth became tradition. Children who were once spoken about quietly became spoken about confidently. The uncertainty of the first encounter was replaced by certainty borrowed from rumor. A story told often enough stops sounding like a guess. It becomes part of the landscape. No one questions it because no one remembers a time before it existed. This is how collective imagination works. It is not wild or chaotic. It is efficient. It reduces complexity into shapes that fit comfortably into shared understanding. A malnourished body becomes a different kind of body. A displaced child becomes a visitor from elsewhere. A medical condition becomes an identity. And once identity is assigned, observation changes. Every behavior is filtered through expectation. Silence confirms mystery. Illness confirms otherness. Recovery, if it happens, is explained away. The story protects itself. Modern readers sometimes imagine these legends forming in moments of panic or hysteria, but that is rarely the case. They formed slowly through conversation, through small assumptions layered gently over time. No single voice created them. Everyone contributed a little. Responsibility dissolved into the collective. This makes the stories harder to challenge. There is no villain to confront, no deliberate falsehood to expose, only a shared misunderstanding reinforced by fear and limited knowledge. Science does not confront these stories aggressively. It approaches them sideways. It asks different questions. Instead of asking what people believed, it asks what bodies show. Instead of asking what communities said, it asks what conditions existed. And the answers are consistent. Wherever these stories appear, scarcity is nearby. Wherever difference is exaggerated, instability follows. Wherever imagination flourishes, information is absent. Children absorb their environment physically. Hunger shapes growth. Stress alters development. Trauma delays speech. Migration disrupts behavior. None of this was invisible. It was simply uninterpretable at the time. The unsettling realization is not that people invented explanations, but that they had few alternatives. Knowledge does not spread evenly. Biology took centuries to develop language precise enough to describe variation without judgment. Before that language existed, stories carried the weight. History then inherited those stories without their original uncertainty. What began as "we don't know" became "this is what they were." The distance between question and answer collapsed. Late at night, listening to these patterns unfold, something softens. The stories lose their sharpness. They no longer feel eerie, they feel heavy, weighted with misplaced meaning. The children at the center of these legends did not experience themselves as symbols. They experienced hunger, confusion, isolation, recovery, or decline. Their inner lives were not mysterious. Only their outward appearance was. History rarely preserved their voices. It preserved reactions to them instead. And reactions tell us more about the observers than the observed. When science reframes these narratives, it does not erase imagination. It contextualizes it. It shows how imagination filled gaps left by survival-focused societies. It reveals how creativity functioned as explanation when explanation was unavailable. The truth once revealed does not feel dramatic. It feels stabilizing. It removes the need for spectacle. It allows the past to feel less threatening. The legends fade not because they are disproven aggressively, but because they are no longer necessary. Understanding replaces invention. Compassion replaces curiosity. As this chapter draws to a close, the collective imagination loosens its grip. The children step back into history not as anomalies, but as reminders of how easily misunderstanding becomes narrative, and how quietly narrative becomes belief. There is no final revelation waiting here. No hidden origin story, only a steady pattern, repeated across time. Difference, observed without explanation. Fear softened into story, story hardened into legend. And once that pattern is recognized, it loses its power. The past grows quieter. The imagination rests. The children at last are no longer asked to carry meanings they never chose. They are allowed to be what they always were. Human bodies shaped by circumstance. Lives intersecting briefly with fear. And then, gently, fading back into ordinary history. That ordinariness is where the chapter ends. As the stories finally settle, what remains is a quiet discomfort, not because the past was cruel in spectacular ways, but because it was ordinary. There were no grand villains shaping these legends, no deliberate acts of invention designed to deceive future generations. There were only people trying to make sense of what they saw with the tools they had. Collective imagination was not a failure of morality. It was a response to uncertainty. When biology had no language, when medicine had no framework, when migration disrupted familiarity, imagination stepped in to smooth the edges. It gave shape to fear so fear could be carried. Over time, those shapes hardened. Children stopped being children and became stories. Bodies stopped being bodies and became symbols. The human cost dissolved into narrative convenience. History preserved the outline, not the life. Modern understanding does not undo what happened. It cannot give names back to every child turned into legend. It cannot restore voices that were never recorded. But it can change how we listen. It can strip away the excess meaning and return weight to its proper place. The truth is quieter than the stories. It does not glow. It does not frighten. It simply explains. Hunger alters bodies. Trauma alters behavior. Displacement alters identity. None of this requires mystery. None of it requires imagination. But all of it once demanded explanation. When that explanation came from fear rather than knowledge, imagination did what it always does. It filled the space completely. Late at night, this realization does not disturb sleep. It steadies it. The legends no longer hover as eerie tales of otherness. They dissolve into a familiar human pattern, repeated wherever knowledge is absent and difference appears. The unsettling part is not that people believed these stories. It is how easily belief became inheritance, how rarely it was questioned, how comfortably it settled into history. And yet, once seen clearly, it loses its grip. The children at the center of these tales no longer need to represent anything. They are released from metaphor. They are no longer warnings, curiosities, or proof of something larger. They are allowed to be small again, fragile, temporary, human. History becomes gentler when it admits this. It stops using difference as spectacle. It stops mistaking suffering for mystery. It allows the imagination to rest, no longer required to explain what science can now describe. As this chapter closes, nothing dramatic resolves. There is no final answer, no sharp conclusion. Only a soft understanding that legends often say more about fear than fact. And the truth, when it arrives, does not shout. It settles. And in that settling, the past grows quieter, the stories loosen their hold, and the night becomes calm enough for the mind to drift, knowing that what once seemed strange was simply human, seen without the knowledge to recognize itself. Chapter 5: Marks that were mistaken for magic. There is something deeply flattering about believing the past was constantly surrounded by magic. It makes old stones feel wiser. It makes empty spaces feel intentional. It allows every scratch, symbol, or awkward carving to glow faintly with supernatural purpose. But this belief says less about medieval minds and more about modern boredom with silence. For a long time, historians treated unexplained marks as invitations to speculate. A spiral carved into wood must have summoned something. A star scratched into stone surely kept something away. Lines crossing lines had to mean protection, warning, or ritual. No one wanted to accept the most uncomfortable explanation of all. Someone was bored. Medieval people spent a remarkable amount of time waiting for prayers to end, waiting for meetings to finish, waiting for weather to change, waiting for food to cook, waiting for guards to rotate, waiting in poorly lit spaces with sharp objects nearby. This combination alone explains far more marks than magic ever could. Churches were not quiet sanctuaries filled with constant awe. They were cold, drafty buildings where services lasted far too long and benches were uncomfortable. People shifted, people scratched, people carved. When hands are idle and stone is soft, Meaning tends to follow the tool, not the intention. Modern researchers began to notice patterns that mythology ignored. The marks clustered at arm height. They appeared where people stood, leaned, or waited. They overlapped each other messily, suggesting repetition rather than ceremony. Some even included names, initials, crude drawings, or dates, which immediately ruined any remaining sense of mystical elegance. A pentagram loses much of its cosmic authority when it sits next to "Thomas was here" and a poorly drawn horse. Scientific documentation revealed something even more disappointing. Many of these marks were inconsistent. The same symbol appeared with different meanings in different places. Some were inverted, some incomplete, some combined randomly. This is not how serious ritual works. This is how distraction works. The belief in magical symbols thrives on the assumption that medieval people were constantly afraid. Afraid of demons, afraid of curses, afraid of invisible forces lurking behind every wall. Fear certainly existed, but it was not the dominant mood of daily life. Most people were far more concerned with sore backs, bad weather, and whether lunch would happen on time. Graffiti is not a modern invention. It is a human reflex. Wherever people pause long enough, they leave marks. These marks do not need deep meaning. They need surfaces and time. Archaeologists cataloging thousands of carvings discovered that many were placed during renovations or construction phases. Workers carved while waiting for instructions. Guards carved while standing watch. Apprentices carved while pretending to pay attention. The marks became records of presence, not protection. "I was here" is one of humanity's oldest statements. It predates writing, religion, and magic. It requires no belief system, only a moment of boredom and a hard surface. The irony is that modern observers often bring more imagination to these marks than their creators ever did. A bored monk scratching circles into limestone becomes a guardian of cosmic knowledge centuries later. A tired laborer carving a shape he half remembers becomes a ritual specialist by accident. Science has been relentlessly unromantic about this. Laser scanning, wear analysis, and contextual placement all point toward mundane origins. The marks are shallow, inconsistent, hastily made. They show no evidence of repetition in ritual patterns. They lack the precision associated with intentional symbolism. Even the so-called protective marks often appear in places where protection would be useless. Random walls, inconvenient corners, places no one would think to defend if danger were the concern. What they do match perfectly are areas where people stood long enough to get bored. There is something gently humorous in realizing that many arcane symbols were probably carved by someone thinking about dinner. The past does not lose dignity when this is acknowledged. It gains relatability. Medieval people stop being haunted silhouettes and become what they were. Humans passing time poorly. They fidgeted, they doodled, they scratched patterns without commitment. Not every mark was meaningless, of course. Some symbols did carry cultural weight. Some did reflect belief. But belief does not require mystery to function. It operates alongside routine. A person could believe in unseen forces and still carve a shape simply because their hand needed something to do. Modern myth-making struggles with this duality. It prefers clean categories, sacred or profane, magical or meaningless. The truth sits uncomfortably in between. People are capable of believing deeply and acting casually at the same time. Late at night, This realization is oddly soothing. The walls stop whispering. The symbols stop staring back. The imagination relaxes once it is no longer required to decode every scratch as a message. History becomes quieter when we stop insisting it was always serious. The idea that every carving carried intention is exhausting. It turns buildings into puzzles. It turns listening into work. When we allow for boredom, everything softens. A scratched circle is just a circle. A crossed line is just a crossed line. A poorly drawn animal is just someone with time and no talent. Science does not mock these marks. It contextualizes them. It asks who was there, how long they stood, what tools they held, and what else they might have been doing. The answers are consistently ordinary. What feels unsettling is how easily imagination fills gaps left by silence. A wall does not explain itself. A symbol does not protest interpretation. Without restraint, meaning expands to fill every surface. The medieval world did not carve magic into every stone. It carved impatience, distraction, and presence. When we accept this, the past becomes lighter. It stops pressing significance onto every detail. It allows us to listen without searching. As this chapter settles, the marks lose their glow. Not because they are unimportant, but because they no longer need to be extraordinary. They are traces of people passing time in spaces that outlasted them. Someone stood here. Someone waited here. Someone scratched something here because silence was long. That is not magic. It is human. And in the stillness of late-night history, that ordinariness is not disappointing. It is calming. What makes these marks especially vulnerable to exaggeration is silence. Stone does not explain itself. Wood does not annotate intention. A scratch remains a scratch until someone decides it must mean more. And once meaning is assigned, it becomes strangely difficult to remove, even when evidence politely suggests otherwise. Modern observers often assume that past people had more time for symbolism than they actually did. In reality, they had less time for everything. Life was crowded with labor, obligation, and discomfort. The moments that allowed carving were not moments of ritual focus. They were moments of pause, a pause between tasks, a pause between instructions, a pause while someone else talked for far too long. Boredom is rarely granted historical significance, yet it explains an enormous amount of material culture. It explains repetition without precision. It explains half-finished shapes. It explains why some symbols trail off awkwardly, as if the person suddenly remembered they were supposed to be doing something else. It also explains inconsistency. Magical systems tend to be disciplined. Graffiti does not. When the same shape appears rotated, distorted, stretched, or interrupted by cracks, it suggests distraction rather than doctrine. Belief seeks clarity. Boredom tolerates mess. Some carvings even overlap each other, layered without respect, as if one bored person carved over another bored person's boredom. This is not reverence, this is competition for surface space. Researchers studying tool marks noticed something quietly amusing. Many scratches match the exact reach of a standing arm, not kneeling, not bowing, standing, leaning, waiting. The posture of someone enduring time rather than engaging mystery. There is also the matter of skill. Truly symbolic systems tend to be taught. They show training. Many of these marks show none. Lines wobble, circles drift, proportions collapse. This is not the hand of a ritual specialist. This is the hand of someone killing time. And yet, centuries later, these clumsy marks were granted enormous responsibility. They were asked to guard buildings, summon forces, repel danger, or communicate hidden knowledge. The marks themselves never agreed to this job. The humor here is gentle but unavoidable. Entire theories were built on scratches that likely took less than a minute to make. Hours of modern debate were fueled by seconds of medieval impatience. The past did not leave us a coded message. It left us evidence of waiting. When this becomes clear, the fear drains away. The symbols stop feeling charged. They no longer hum with imagined power. They sit quietly, doing what they always did. Nothing at all. This does not mean medieval people lacked belief. It means belief did not dominate every idle moment. Humans are capable of reverence and restlessness at the same time. A person could believe deeply and still carve nonsense while waiting for something else to happen. Late at night, this understanding feels especially fitting. Listening slows, the urge to decode fades, the walls become walls again, the scratches become marks of presence rather than portals to something unseen. History becomes kinder when it admits how much of it was accidental. Not everything survived because it mattered. Some things survived because no one bothered to remove them. As this chapter comes to rest, the idea of magic softens into something more familiar. Not illusion, but projection. The need to believe that every trace carries intention says more about us than about the past. The truth is smaller and more comfortable. People got bored. People carved. People moved on. The marks stayed. They do not protect. They do not warn. They do not summon. They simply remind us that long before modern life, people still waited, fidgeted, and left marks behind to prove they were there. And that, quietly, is where the magic ends, replaced by something far more human and far easier to fall asleep to. As the chapter settles, the marks finally stop asking to be interpreted. They sit quietly in their places, relieved of responsibility. No longer guardians, no longer warnings, no longer invitations to fear, just traces left behind by people who had hands, time, and very little else to do in that moment. The past does not feel diminished by this understanding. It feels closer, more familiar, less theatrical. When magic is removed from every scratch, what remains is not emptiness but presence. Someone stood here long enough to leave a sign of themselves. That sign does not need a grand explanation to matter. There is a certain comfort in knowing that history is not always intentional, that not every surviving detail was meant to survive. Some things endured simply because no one erased them. Stone kept marks the way memory keeps habits, without judgment, without selection. The idea that medieval people were constantly encoding meaning into their surroundings is exhausting. It turns every surface into a puzzle and every night into an investigation. When we let boredom exist in the past, history relaxes. It stops performing. It becomes easier to sit with. The humor in this realization is gentle and human. Entire books were written about scratches made by people waiting for something else to happen. Academic arguments unfolded over marks that probably accompanied size and shifting weight. The seriousness of later interpretation far outweighed the seriousness of the act itself. Science does not strip these marks of value, it rescues them from exaggeration. It returns them to the scale they were made in. Small actions, idle moments, passing time. In that scale, they finally make sense. Late at night, this is the kind of history that settles the mind. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing hides behind the walls. The past is no longer whispering. It is sitting quietly, doing what people have always done when waiting feels long. They scratched, they marked, they moved on. The magic was never in the marks. It was in the imagination that came later, and once that imagination rests, the stones rest too. With that, this chapter ends softly. The symbols fade back into scratches. The walls grow quiet again, and history, relieved of unnecessary mystery, becomes calm enough to let sleep arrive without resistance. Chapter 6. Cities that Vanished Because of Weather, Not Punishment. When a city disappears, people rarely accept the explanation that it simply failed to stay dry. That answer feels small, uninspiring, almost rude. A city, after all, is supposed to matter. It is supposed to fall dramatically, with meaning attached, preferably involving moral decline and a cautionary lesson for future generations who will absolutely ignore it anyway. So, when medieval and early modern cities were swallowed by water, buried under silt, or slowly abandoned after repeated flooding, observers reached for stories that felt more satisfying. The city must have sinned. The people must have grown arrogant. Someone must have offended something unseen. Weather alone seemed too boring to justify ruins. But weather is persistent, and boredom is one of its most effective tools. Many lost cities did not vanish overnight. They drowned slowly, year by year, storm by storm. Tides crept higher, rivers changed course, drainage systems failed quietly, repairs were delayed, maintenance budgets disappeared long before the city itself did. Nothing supernatural was required, only time, water, and optimism. Optimism in particular played a major role. Communities believed they could manage their environment because they had always managed it before. A dike held last year, so it would hold this year. A canal drained last season, so it would drain again. Early engineering successes bred confidence that outpaced reality. When nature adjusted slightly, humans adjusted slowly. Sea levels rose not with drama, but with paperwork. Repairs were proposed, debated, postponed. Materials were scarce, skilled labor was expensive, political priorities shifted. Meanwhile, water did what water does best. It ignored arguments. Later storytellers preferred punishment narratives because they provided clarity. A city destroyed for its sins made sense. A city abandoned because the drainage system was poorly maintained and no one wanted to pay for upgrades felt unsatisfying. There is no villain in that story, only committees. Geology, unfortunately, does not care about morality. It responds to pressure, erosion, and gravity. Coastal settlements built on unstable ground were always temporary, even when they looked permanent. Rivers meandered. Marshlands shifted. Storm surges intensified. Climate patterns changed gradually, not symbolically. Medieval climate fluctuations, especially periods of increased storms and cooler temperatures, placed enormous strain on infrastructure that was already fragile. Dikes required constant upkeep. Channels silted faster than they could be cleared. One missed season of maintenance could undo decades of work. When failure came, it rarely announced itself as catastrophe. It arrived as inconvenience. Streets flooded more often, cellars stayed damp, crops failed near the edges. People adapted at first, raised floors, rerouted paths. Temporary fixes multiplied. Temporary fixes have a habit of becoming permanent plans. Eventually, adaptation turned into exhaustion. People moved uphill. Trade shifted. Houses were abandoned selectively. The city did not fall. It thinned. It hollowed. It lost importance before it lost structure. By the time ruins were obvious, life had already gone elsewhere. Centuries later, ruins invite interpretation. Silence invites judgment. Observers look at empty streets and imagine divine displeasure rather than sediment buildup. It feels appropriate that something as dramatic as a lost city should have offended something equally dramatic. But nature does not stage morality plays. It follows rules. Those rules are repetitive, predictable, and deeply uninterested in human behavior beyond physics. Floodwaters do not ask who deserves them. Storm surges do not check for virtue. Erosion does not respond to prayer or punishment. The irony is that ancient engineers often understood this better than later storytellers. They wrote about maintenance, they worried about water flow, they tracked tides and weather patterns. Their concerns were practical, not moral. What failed was not knowledge, but capacity. Resources were limited. Coordination was imperfect. Political stability wavered. Repairs lagged. None of this makes for compelling legend. Science approaches these vanished cities with instruments rather than judgment. Sediment layers tell the story clearly. Flood deposits align with historical storms. Shorelines map retreat over time. Building foundations show repeated water damage and repair attempts. The evidence is consistent. The city did not anger nature. It underestimated it. There is gentle humor in how desperately people want the past to have been warned. As if cities ignored clear signs out of arrogance, rather than because the signs arrived slowly, quietly, and inconveniently. Water does not knock. It seeps. Late at night, this realization feels oddly comforting. It removes the pressure of cosmic meaning. It replaces divine punishment with maintenance logs. The past becomes less dramatic and more familiar. Cities disappear today for similar reasons. Floodplains are still occupied. Infrastructure still ages. Budgets still shrink. Confidence still outpaces caution. The difference is documentation, not behavior. When ancient cities vanished, they did not deliver lessons. We invented lessons later to make the loss feel useful. But the earth did not intend instruction. It intended balance. The desire for moral explanation reveals discomfort with randomness. We prefer stories where destruction has purpose, but nature operates without narrative. It does not reward or punish. It adjusts. Understanding this does not make history colder. It makes it clearer. The ruins stop accusing. They stop warning. They simply exist as evidence of limits. As this chapter moves toward rest, the drowned cities lose their dramatic edge. They become places where people lived, built, repaired, worried, delayed, and eventually left. Not because they were wicked, because staying became harder than leaving. There is no curse beneath the water, no message etched into sediment. only layers of earth responding to pressure and time. And in that quiet explanation, history becomes less anxious. The past no longer demands moral alignment. It asks only to be read accurately. The city did not vanish because it deserved to. It vanished because water rose, ground shifted, and maintenance failed. Nature did not make a statement. It followed a rule. That rule continues whether we listen or not. And with that understanding, this chapter settles gently, leaving behind not fear or judgment, but a calm recognition that the earth moves according to itself, and human stories, however elaborate, are always built on ground that never promised to stay still. There is also a quiet irony in how much effort later generations put into moralizing these losses. Long after the water receded or settled permanently into place, people arrived with stories ready-made. They preferred explanations that involved judgment, because judgment feels purposeful. It suggests that disasters happen for reasons we can understand, and therefore avoid, if only we behave correctly. Maintenance schedules are far less reassuring. Maps tell a different story. When geologists trace coastlines across centuries, they do not see sudden punishment. They see gradual retreat. When sediment cores are examined, they do not record outrage or warning. They record repetition. Flood after flood. Storm after storm. Layer upon layer of quiet insistence. The cities that vanished were often not foolish. They were ambitious. They settled near water because water meant trade, transport, food, and connection. These advantages outweighed long-term risk, especially when long-term was difficult to imagine. A city built to thrive today rarely plans for conditions 3 centuries later. Engineering extended hope. Dikes, canals, embankments, and drainage systems worked until they didn't. Each successful repair reinforced confidence. Each avoided disaster postponed difficult decisions. The failure was not ignorance, but optimism stretched too far. This is where the humor becomes almost gentle. Entire moral legends grew out of what were essentially overdue infrastructure problems. A city that could not afford another round of repairs was remembered as corrupt. A port overwhelmed by rising water became decadent. The narrative comforted survivors who needed meaning more than accuracy. Nature did not cooperate with this storytelling. It never adjusted its behavior to match the lesson. Water kept rising. Rivers kept shifting. The same processes continued elsewhere, indifferent to how they were interpreted. Late at night, this indifference feels soothing. It removes accusation from the ruins. The stones no longer feel judged, they feel tired, like structures that did their best within limits and were eventually released. The past becomes easier to sit with when we stop asking it to be dramatic. The cities that disappeared were not warnings carved into the earth. They were experiments that reached their expiration date. Some lasted centuries. Some barely made it through a few generations. All were temporary, even when they believed otherwise. Modern parallels are impossible to ignore, though history does not insist we notice them. Coastal development continues. Floodplains remain attractive. Maintenance remains unglamorous. Confidence still outpaces caution. The difference is not wisdom, it is documentation. Understanding vanished cities as victims of weather and physics does not remove responsibility from humans. It clarifies it. Decisions mattered, budgets mattered, priorities mattered. But none of these were moral in the cosmic sense. They were administrative, practical, and often constrained. The earth responded accordingly. As this chapter comes to rest, the idea of punishment fades completely. There is no finger pointing from beneath the water, no lesson waiting to be decoded, only evidence of how environments and structures interact over time. Cities did not vanish because they were bad. They vanished because conditions changed faster than systems could adapt. Nature did not send messages. It followed rules. And those rules are still in place, quietly repeating themselves, whether anyone chooses to frame them as warnings or not. With that realization, the ruins grow still. They stop demanding interpretation. They no longer ask to be feared or admired. They simply remain where they are, shaped by forces that never cared about morality. In the calm of late-night history, this is enough. The city rests, the water rests. The story no longer needs a lesson. It only needs accuracy. And once accuracy settles in, the past becomes quieter, less accusatory, and far easier to drift alongside, knowing that disappearance does not always mean judgment, and that sometimes the ground simply moves on. As the chapter settles, the ruins finally lose their moral burden. They no longer stand as warnings etched into stone, demanding interpretation. They stop accusing the people who lived there of arrogance, decadence, or invisible wrongdoing. They become what they always were, the remains of systems pushed beyond what they could reasonably endure. There is something almost tender in this realization. Cities did not disappear in moments of theatrical collapse. They endured, they adapted, they patched, they negotiated with water and weather for as long as they could. When that negotiation failed, people did the most human thing possible. They left. Leaving is rarely remembered as heroism. It does not sound noble. It does not fit well into stories that prefer dramatic endings, but leaving is often the most rational response to an environment that no longer cooperates. History tends to judge it harshly because it lacks spectacle. The truth is that these cities were not punished. They were outpaced. Climate shifted slightly. Sea levels crept higher. Rivers ignored old agreements. Maintenance fell behind. None of this required malice or intention. It required only time and repetition. 8 generations, uncomfortable with such quiet explanations, layered meaning over absence. They turned abandonment into consequence. They made the earth speak when it had said nothing at all. The moral story felt safer than admitting how vulnerable human systems really are. Geology remains unimpressed by these narratives. Sediment continues to accumulate. Shorelines continue to migrate. Water continues to follow gravity rather than virtue. The earth keeps its own schedule, one that rarely aligns with human symbolism. Late at night, this understanding removes tension from the ruins. The stones no longer feel ominous. They feel tired, like foundations that did what they could until the conditions changed. There is no shame in that. There is only limit. The humor here is quiet but persistent. Entire legends grew out of drainage failures. Grand warnings were constructed from erosion charts. Cities were accused of moral collapse when the real collapse involved neglected embankments and underestimated tides. Nature, meanwhile, never commented. As this chapter closes, the vanished cities return to a simpler category. Not cursed, not condemned, just outdated, built for one set of conditions and asked to survive another. They did not fail a test of virtue. They failed a test of physics. And physics does not negotiate. With that clarity, the story relaxes. The past no longer insists on teaching a lesson. It allows itself to be understood without drama. The earth keeps moving. The water keeps rising or receding. Human stories follow afterward, trying to catch up. In the calm of late-night history, this is enough. The cities rest where they fell. The weather moves on, and the listener is left not with fear or judgment, but with a steady, grounding thought. Disappearance does not always mean punishment, and nature does not send messages. It only follows rules. And those rules, quiet and patient, continue long after the stories stop. Chapter 7: Mysterious Rituals and the Long Life of Misunderstanding. There is a particular excitement people feel when they encounter an old place that refuses to explain itself. A cave with dark corners, a stone circle without instructions, a room underground that feels intentionally inconvenient. Modern imagination steps forward, eagerly, relieved to finally use the word ritual. It sounds important. It sounds ancient. It sounds like someone, somewhere, knew something we do not. The problem is that imagination moves much faster than dating methods. Many sites accused of hosting secret ceremonies or belonging to hidden orders are not ancient at all. They are younger than the stories told about them. Some were built centuries later than assumed. Others were modified repeatedly, each generation leaving its own practical adjustments behind. By the time archaeologists arrive, the layers are so mixed that fantasy rushes in to organize them emotionally, if not chronologically. People prefer mystery to measurement. Mystery flatters curiosity. Measurement feels tedious. It requires patience, equipment, and the willingness to accept unexciting answers. When a cave feels old, we assume it must be meaningful. When a structure looks intentional, we assume intention must have been ceremonial. But intention is not always mystical. Sometimes it is architectural. Sometimes it is economic. Sometimes it is simply someone needing storage space where weather could not reach it. Caves, in particular, suffer greatly from overinterpretation. Humans have always used caves. They are dry, stable, and naturally protected. They are excellent for shelter, storage, animals, tools, and people who want to be left alone. None of these uses require secrecy or symbolism. They require practicality, yet caves are dark. Darkness invites projection. If a space is difficult to access, modern observers assume it must have been designed that way for ritual reasons. The idea that someone built something awkward because it was the only available option is deeply unsatisfying. Stone circles experience a similar fate. Stones arranged in patterns look deliberate, so the mind leaps to ceremony. Few people enjoy hearing that stones were sometimes arranged for landmarking, construction staging, or resource management. These explanations lack drama. They do not suggest chanting. Modern fascination with secret societies plays a role here. We like the idea that history hid its most important knowledge away from ordinary people. It reassures us that confusion has an explanation. If something feels unclear, it must be because it was meant to be hidden, not because it was never significant to begin with. Chronological analysis disrupts this comfort. Radiocarbon dating, tool mark analysis, material sourcing, and stratigraphy consistently reveal inconvenient timelines. A structure believed to be prehistoric turns out to be medieval. A ritual chamber turns out to be a later storage modification. A sacred passage turns out to be a drainage solution that worked poorly. The humor here is gentle but persistent. Entire books have been written about secret rites performed in spaces that were not yet built when the supposed rituals allegedly occurred. The dates simply do not cooperate with the stories. But stories rarely retreat easily. Once a place has been labeled mysterious, it resists correction. Visitors arrive expecting secrecy. Guides repeat legends because legends sell. The site becomes emotionally invested in its own mythology. Removing the mystery feels like theft. Science, however, does not negotiate with atmosphere. It measures, it samples, it checks, it asks when, not why, and when the when changes, the entire narrative collapses quietly. Many so-called ritual sites were not designed for gatherings at all. Their acoustics are poor, their spaces are cramped, their access routes are inconvenient. If secrecy were the goal, efficiency was ignored completely. These are not features of planned ceremonies. They are features of spaces adapted for survival, storage, or temporary use. The modern mind struggles with this because it wants purpose. It wants meaning layered over stone. It wants ancestors to have been constantly performing something profound. Accepting that many structures were simply built to solve immediate problems feels anticlimactic. But anticlimax is historically accurate. People in the past were busy. They did not have endless time to choreograph symbolic experiences. They worked, worried, repaired, adjusted, and reused spaces as needed. A room could serve one purpose for a century, another for the next, and end up misunderstood by everyone afterward. Later observers collapse all these uses into a single narrative because it feels cleaner. Unfortunately, cleanliness is not a reliable historical indicator. The phrase ancient ritual often functions as a placeholder for uncertainty. It allows people to stop asking questions. Once a site is declared ceremonial, investigation ends. Mystery becomes the explanation rather than the problem. Science reopens the problem quietly. It does not accuse past people of ignorance. It questions modern assumptions instead. It reveals how often interpretation raced ahead of evidence, driven by excitement rather than restraint. Late at night, this realization feels oddly soothing. The world becomes less crowded with hidden meanings. The caves stop whispering, the stones stop staring. The pressure to decode every space dissolves. Not every underground chamber hides a secret. Not every circle was built to be stared at reverently. Not every awkward space was designed for initiation. Some places were just places. The irony is that misunderstanding persists longest where checking is easiest. Dates can be tested, materials can be analyzed, but imagination prefers repetition to revision. Once a story feels ancient, it becomes emotionally protected. History, however, is not responsible for protecting our favorite ideas. It is responsible for accuracy. And accuracy, while less thrilling, offers something better: stability. As this chapter drifts toward rest, the so-called rituals soften into routines. The secret orders fade into construction phases. The dramatic ceremonies resolve into practical adaptations layered across time. The past does not lose richness when mystery is removed. It gains coherence. The spaces become readable again, not as symbols, but as environments shaped by need. And need, unlike myth, is universal. When we allow chronology to speak louder than imagination, the sites relax. They no longer perform. They no longer promise revelation. They simply exist, grounded in time rather than fantasy. That grounding is calming. It removes urgency. It replaces suspicion with sequence. The truth is not hidden. It is dated. And once dated, it stops asking to be feared or revered. It asks only to be understood slowly, quietly, without expectation of secrets waiting behind every stone. That understanding is where this chapter settles. What makes these misunderstandings so durable is not ignorance, but enthusiasm. People want ancient places to feel important the moment they step inside them. Silence feels suspicious. Darkness feels intentional. Uneven stone feels symbolic. The modern imagination fills these gaps quickly, not out of malice, but out of a desire for experience. A cave that is merely old is interesting. A cave that hides a secret feels alive. This desire quietly discourages verification. Dating methods are slow. Results are often approximate. They come with margins of error and cautious language. Stories, on the other hand, arrive fully formed. They offer certainty without measurement. Once a narrative attaches itself to a site, it becomes part of the visit. Questioning it feels like breaking the atmosphere. Archaeology has learned to work around this resistance. Instead of confronting myths head-on, it disassembles them patiently. Layers are separated. Modifications are dated individually. Tool marks are examined for consistency. Materials are traced to sources that did not exist when the supposed rituals were meant to occur. The results are rarely shocking. They are quietly corrective. A chamber believed to host ancient initiations turns out to have been widened in the late medieval period to store goods. A tunnel, assumed to guide ceremonial movement, reveals wear patterns consistent with animals, not people. A carved niche, thought to hold sacred objects, aligns perfectly with practical lighting needs. Each detail nudges the story away from secrecy and toward utility. The humor lies in how often modern people accuse the past of imagination while exercising far more of it themselves. Medieval builders are credited with elaborate symbolic intent, while contemporary observers invent entire belief systems based on mood. The imbalance is almost elegant. There is also a comforting humility in accepting that not every place was designed to impress. Some spaces were uncomfortable because comfort was not a priority. Some layouts were confusing because they evolved gradually. Some structures were reused so often that their original purpose blurred beyond recognition. None of this requires conspiracy. It requires time. Late at night, when listening slows, this perspective feels grounding. The pressure to interpret fades, the spaces stop performing. A cave becomes a cave again. A room becomes a room. Stone becomes material rather than message. The phrase secret ritual loses its power once chronology enters the conversation. Secrets require intention. Intention requires coordination. Coordination leaves patterns. Many of these sites show no such patterns. They show improvisation, repair, and adaptation. They show people solving problems with what they had. Modern fascination with hidden orders says more about modern uncertainty than historical practice. We like to imagine that meaning was once centralized, guarded, and lost. It gives confusion a direction. But history rarely operated that way. Knowledge was scattered, practical, and often forgotten without ceremony. When we accept this, the sites relax into something more honest. They become records of use rather than stages for belief. They no longer demand reverence or suspicion. They invite observation. As this chapter comes to rest, the long misunderstandings lose their urgency. The caves stop whispering. The stones stop implying. The rituals dissolve into routines stretched across centuries. Not everything old was secret. Not everything hidden was intentional. Not every dark place held knowledge. Sometimes it just held supplies, or animals, or people who wanted shelter from weather and noise. The past does not owe us mystery. It owes us context. And once context is restored, the imagination can finally rest, relieved of the burden of inventing ceremonies where none were ever meant to exist. With that calm realization, this chapter closes softly. The sites remain grounded in time rather than fantasy, and history becomes quieter once again, no longer echoing with imagined chants, but with the far more human sounds of building, adapting, and moving on. As the chapter settles, the last remaining tension dissolves quietly. The need for hidden meaning loosens its grip. The places once burdened with imagined rituals finally get to rest as what they always were. Spaces shaped by use, reuse, and convenience. They stop performing for modern curiosity and return to their original role, background to ordinary human activity. There is something almost soothing about this demotion. When a cave is allowed to be just a cave, it becomes easier to breathe inside it. When a stone arrangement is understood as practical rather than prophetic, the weight lifts. The past no longer watches us expectantly, waiting to be decoded. The long life of misunderstanding reveals a simple pattern. Whenever chronology feels boring, imagination volunteers. Whenever measurement feels slow, myth speeds things up. And whenever certainty is desired, mystery is assigned. These habits are not historical. They are human. What archaeology offers is not disenchantment, but balance. It reminds us that people built things for reasons that made sense at the time, even if those reasons no longer impress. Storage mattered, shelter mattered, drainage mattered, space mattered. Ceremony, when it existed, did not require secrecy to function. Late at night, this realization does not disappoint. It calms. The pressure to find significance everywhere fades. The world becomes quieter when not every shadow hides intention. The mind drifts more easily when history stops whispering invented secrets. The irony remains gentle. Modern people accuse the past of superstition while projecting elaborate fantasies onto ordinary stone. Ancient builders are imagined as members of secret orders, while contemporary observers refuse to check dates. The humor here is not mocking, it is humbling. Once the dates are aligned and the layers separated, nothing dramatic collapses. The stories simply shrink. They lose their excess. What remains is not emptiness, but clarity. The caves remain dark. The stones remain still. The rooms remain awkwardly shaped, but they no longer demand belief. They become readable in a quieter way, as records of adaptation rather than initiation. They show how often humans solved problems without thinking they were creating mystery for anyone else. As this chapter closes, the imagined rituals fade without protest. No secrets are lost. No truths are hidden. Only the unnecessary noise falls away. History exhales. The past does not become smaller when mystery is removed. It becomes steadier, more trustworthy, easier to sit with. Not every place was meant to be sacred. Not every structure guarded knowledge. Not every cave kept a secret. Some places were just used, reused, and left behind. And once that is accepted, the long misunderstanding ends gently, allowing both the sight and the listener to rest, knowing that history does not need to be magical to be meaningful, and that sometimes the most accurate explanation is also the quietest one. Chapter 8: Collective Events That No One Understood. History has a habit of panicking when many people behave strangely at the same time. One person acting oddly can be ignored, two can be blamed on coincidence. But when an entire crowd begins to shake, faint, dance, collapse, or lose control in unison, explanation becomes urgent. And when explanation is unavailable, history reaches for the loudest word it has: madness. For a long time, collective episodes were described as outbreaks of insanity, dancing until exhaustion, laughing without stopping, falling ill without visible cause, sudden waves of weakness, confusion, or uncontrollable movement spreading through towns. These events were treated as proof that something had gone terribly wrong with human reason itself. What history rarely considered was how much strain people were under before these events occurred. Modern analysis approaches these episodes without theatrical language. It asks about food supply, labor conditions, climate stress, social pressure, and environmental exposure. The results are consistently unromantic. No mass delusion, no shared insanity, just bodies responding to overload. Human physiology is not designed for prolonged scarcity combined with fear. Malnutrition weakens regulation. Stress amplifies reaction. Environmental toxins interfere quietly with neurological function. When these factors converge across a population, behavior shifts collectively, not symbolically, biologically. The irony is that these events were never random. They followed patterns. They appeared during famine, war, plague aftermaths, or economic collapse. They emerged where people were overworked, underfed, and emotionally compressed. The body, deprived of recovery, found alternative outlets. History, however, preferred spectacle. A crowd moving together looked intentional. Intentional behavior demanded explanation. If no practical cause was visible, the explanation became psychological or moral. People must have lost control. They must have succumbed to something invisible. Madness was tidy. It wrapped confusion into a single word. Modern understanding breaks this word apart gently. Collective behavior does not require shared belief. It requires shared conditions. When nervous systems are stressed simultaneously, responses synchronize naturally. This is not hysteria. It is alignment. Crowds amplify signals. Fear spreads. Exhaustion mirrors itself. Weakness becomes visible and therefore permissible. Once one body collapses, others follow. Not because they choose to, but because the conditions finally allow it. One of the most misunderstood elements of these events is agency. Historical descriptions often imply choice. People gave in, people joined, People lost themselves, but under extreme stress, the line between choice and reaction blurs. The body acts before language catches up. Nutritional deficiencies alone explain much of the strangeness. Lack of key nutrients alters cognition, mood, and coordination. Add physical exhaustion, emotional strain, and environmental exposure, and the result is not chaos. It is predictable breakdown. Environmental toxins played a role as well. Contaminated grain, mold exposure, industrial byproducts. None of these were recognized at the time. Symptoms appeared without explanation. When many people shared the same exposure, the symptoms appeared collectively. History mistook correlation for contagion of the mind. It blamed imagination when the problem was chemistry. The humor here is quiet but persistent. Entire generations were declared unstable because their food supply was poor and their workload was impossible. It is a remarkably efficient way to avoid discussing infrastructure. Modern observers sometimes imagine these events as sudden eruptions. In reality, they were releases. Pressure built slowly. Bodies adapted as long as they could. When adaptation failed, expression followed. Not gracefully, not rationally, but understandably. Late at night, this reframing feels calming. The fear drains away. The past no longer feels irrational, it feels tired. History does not go mad, it accumulates strain. Collective events are not evidence of mass confusion, they are evidence of shared limits. When enough people reach those limits simultaneously, behavior changes together. This is not mystery, it is mechanics. What unsettles modern listeners is not the events themselves, but how quickly they were dismissed. Labeling a population mad absolves systems of responsibility. It allows observers to step back comfortably. The problem becomes internal rather than structural. Science reverses this comfortably. It does not shame the past, it explains it. It restores dignity to bodies that reacted exactly as stressed bodies do. It removes the spectacle and replaces it with cause. The past becomes quieter when this happens. The shouting stops. The labels fall away. What remains is a pattern repeated wherever humans are pushed too far for too long. Crowds did not lose reason. They lost resilience. As this chapter continues, the idea of collective madness softens into collective fatigue. The events no longer feel frightening, they feel inevitable under the conditions described. History becomes less dramatic and more honest. The human body has thresholds. Societies do too. When both are exceeded, reaction follows. Not as message, not as warning, as consequence. Late-night history does not ask us to marvel at these moments. It asks us to recognize them, to see that what looked like insanity was often a final coping mechanism, failing all at once. And once that is understood, the fear dissolves. The events settle into their proper place as records of stress rather than mysteries of the mind. The past was not out of control, it was overloaded. And overloaded systems behave predictably, even when the behavior looks strange to those who never felt the pressure themselves. As this chapter drifts toward rest, the crowds grow quiet again. The movement stops, the noise fades. What remains is the understanding that history does not spiral into madness without cause. It reaches exhaustion. And exhaustion, unlike madness, does not need interpretation. It needs rest. With that realization, the chapter settles gently, allowing the listener to drift without fear, knowing that the past was not broken, only pushed too far, and that even collective confusion has an explanation rooted firmly in the body, not in mystery. What often gets lost in retelling these collective episodes is how quietly they began. There was no announcement, no signal, no shared decision to behave differently. The shift happened beneath awareness, accumulating in bodies that had already been asked too much for too long. When the response finally surfaced, it looked dramatic only because the strain had been invisible. History tends to dramatize the moment of collapse rather than the years of pressure that preceded it. A town suddenly moving together seems alarming. A population quietly starving, working, worrying, and enduring does not. Drama attracts attention. Maintenance does not. The phrase mass hysteria became a convenient container. It allowed observers to stop asking practical questions. Food quality no longer mattered. Labor conditions no longer mattered. Environmental exposure no longer mattered. The problem was declared psychological, which meant it could be discussed without responsibility. Modern analysis finds this choice almost elegant in its efficiency. Blame the mind and the system remains untouched. Label the behavior irrational and no structural change is required. It is an old strategy and a remarkably durable one. What science shows instead is that bodies synchronize under shared conditions. Stress hormones rise together, nutritional deficiencies align, sleep deprivation spreads. When regulation fails, movement, emotion, and behavior follow similar paths. This is not imitation. It is resonance. The humor here is subdued but present. History accused people of losing their minds when what they had actually lost was recovery time. Entire communities were described as unstable when the real issue was that no one had eaten properly in months. Collective events did not signal moral decay or intellectual failure. They signaled overload. And overload does not ask permission before it appears. Late at night, this understanding feels stabilizing. The fear associated with these episodes softens. The crowds no longer feel threatening. They feel familiar. Anyone who has experienced prolonged stress recognizes the edge where control thins. The past did not behave irrationally. It behaved predictably under pressure. Once this is accepted, the stories change texture. They lose their sharpness. The language of madness fades, replaced by the language of limits. Bodies reached thresholds. Societies crossed capacity. Reaction followed. History becomes less mysterious and more human when we allow this framing. It stops treating breakdown as spectacle and starts recognizing it as signal. Not a message sent intentionally, but a response emerging inevitably. As this chapter settles, the collective events return to stillness. The movements end, the noise fades. The people are no longer described as confused or possessed. They are understood as exhausted. There is no lesson hidden here, no warning encoded in behavior, only a reminder that human systems, like bodies, have boundaries. When those boundaries are ignored long enough, response replaces choice. The past did not go mad. It ran out of room to cope. And in the calm of late-night history, that realization is not unsettling. It is reassuring. It means there was nothing wrong with the people. The conditions were simply too much. With that quiet clarity, this chapter closes gently. The crowds disperse, the strain releases, And history, no longer accused of madness, is allowed to rest, understood at last as something not broken but overburdened, responding exactly as overburdened things do. What makes these collective episodes uncomfortable is not their scale, but how ordinary they become once the explanation is stripped of drama. When science removes demons, curses, and moral panic, what remains is not exciting. It is fatigue. It is hunger. It is exposure. It is repetition without relief. And that is perhaps why earlier generations preferred stranger explanations. A story about possession is more interesting than a story about malnutrition. A rumor about madness travels faster than a ledger about food shortages. Mystery gives the listener something to feel superior to. Biology does not. Modern researchers peering backward with data instead of fear notice patterns that feel almost dull in their consistency. The same shortages, the same stresses, the same environments, different centuries, different cities, same limits being exceeded quietly until something visible happened. Bodies do not stage protests, they malfunction. And when many bodies are placed under the same conditions, the malfunction looks coordinated, even though it is not. No one planned it. No one led it. The body simply reacted the only way it could. History once called this contagion of behavior. Science now calls it shared exposure. There is something gently ironic in how often societies responded by adding more pressure. People dancing uncontrollably were told to repent. People convulsing were isolated. People fainting were accused of weakness. The environment remained unchanged. The food remained poor. The workload remained heavy. And the bodies, predictably, did not improve. Late at night, this pattern feels familiar. Many listening now know the sensation of operating past capacity while being told nothing is wrong. The medieval crowd does not feel distant in that moment. It feels like an earlier version of the same tired species. The humor here is soft and dry. History kept diagnosing insanity when exhaustion would have sufficed. It blamed the mind when the body was simply done cooperating. Once the pressure lifted, these episodes ended. Not with revelation, not with punishment, with rest, with better food, with quieter conditions, with time. The recovery was unremarkable, which is precisely why it was overlooked. No miracle cured them. No villain caused them. No message was delivered. The system stabilized and the symptoms disappeared. This is the least exciting ending imaginable, which is why it is probably the correct one. History does not spiral into madness without reason. It reaches a point where resilience is depleted. What follows is not insanity, but evidence. Evidence that humans, collectively, respond to overload the same way they always have. They falter together. As this chapter comes to rest, the fear drains away. The crowds dissolve back into individuals. The streets quiet, the bodies recover. What remains is not a warning from the past, but a confirmation. History is not irrational. It is responsive. And when pushed beyond endurance, it does exactly what living systems do. It signals distress. That signal was never meant to be mystical. It was never meant to frighten future generations. It was simply the body multiplied by circumstance, asking, without words, for conditions it could survive. With that understanding, the collective events lose their menace. They soften into something almost tender, a reminder that even centuries ago, people were not losing their minds. They were just very, very tired. And in the quiet of late-night history, that realization settles gently, like a final breath before sleep. Chongqing, the human body, and its strange standards, and the late arrival of science. History has never been very kind to bodies that refuse to cooperate with expectations. Anything that bends, stretches, flattens, narrows, lengthens, or grows in the wrong direction has always made people uncomfortable. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient to explain. And when explanation is hard, imagination tends to panic quietly. In many centuries, a body that looked different was not seen as variation. It was seen as evidence. Evidence of moral failure, evidence of divine displeasure, evidence of something having gone wrong in a way no one could quite name, but everyone felt qualified to judge. The irony, of course, is that most of these unusual bodies were not accidents at all. They were intentional, shaped slowly, carefully, lovingly even. The result of aesthetics, tradition, status, or simple habit repeated often enough to leave a permanent mark. History later called them deformities. Their own societies called them normal. Cranial shaping is a good place to begin, because nothing unsettles the modern imagination faster than a skull that looks unfamiliar. Elongated heads, flattened foreheads, narrowed profiles. For a long time, these were treated as clues to lost civilizations, alien ancestry, or cult behavior. Museums whispered, documentaries leaned forward. The phrase, "mystery remains," appeared far too often. What eventually ruined the mystery was not revelation but patience. Anthropology noticed patterns, archaeology noticed tools, biology noticed timing. These skulls were not the result of disease or mutation. They were shaped in infancy, when bone is cooperative and memory is mercifully absent. Cloth bindings, wooden boards, gentle, persistent pressure applied over months. The goal was not horror, it was beauty. Beauty, inconveniently, does not stay consistent across centuries. Some cultures valued height, others valued width. Some preferred smoothness, others sharp angles. A shaped skull could signal nobility, belonging, or protection. It could say without words that this child was raised correctly, that they belonged, that they were cared for, enough to be shaped slowly. History later recoiled from this, largely because it no longer recognized the aesthetic language, and when people stop recognizing a language, they tend to label it barbaric, or mystical, or pathological, anything except intentional. Feet tell a similar story, though with less academic mystery and more collective discomfort. Foot binding, corsetry, neck rings, scarification, dental alteration. All have been described as cruelty by outsiders who, at the same time, were tightening their own clothing until breathing became optional. Judgment, it seems, travels well across borders. The body has always been a canvas, and every era pretends it discovered this fact for the first time. What science eventually clarified is not that these practices were harmless, but that they were comprehensible. They followed logic. They served social systems. They were not accidents. They were choices made within constraints, often passed down by people who believed they were doing the best for the next generation. This is not romantic. It is human. For centuries, bodies that did not align with expectation were treated as symbols rather than organisms. A curved spine meant moral weakness. Unusual proportions suggested divine commentary. Even illness was interpreted theatrically, as though the body had been cast in a morality play without consent. When science finally arrived with measurements, scans, and long explanations that did not fit neatly into sermons or folklore, it did not destroy these stories. It quietly replaced them. Bones revealed nutrition levels. Teeth recorded childhood stress. Muscle attachments told stories of labor, not sin. Genetic analysis explained traits once attributed to curses. Slowly, the body stopped being a metaphor and started being evidence. This transition was not dramatic. It did not happen all at once. And it certainly did not apologize to the generations who were misunderstood along the way. Science rarely apologizes. It clarifies and moves on. There is something gently amusing about how long humanity insisted the past knew more than it did. We like to imagine ancient people possessed secret knowledge, lost wisdom, or superior understanding. It flatters the mystery, it elevates the confusion, it allows us to avoid admitting that many people simply did not have microscopes, imaging tools, or basic nutritional science. The truth, less poetic but far more useful, is that people knew exactly as much as their tools allowed. And when tools improved, explanations changed. Not because the past was foolish, but because it was operating without information we now take for granted. The body has not changed much. Our interpretations have. One day, it is likely future historians will look at us with the same quiet disbelief. They will examine surgical scars, hormone treatments, cosmetic procedures, performance enhancements, and posture damage from screens. They will read our justifications carefully, nod politely, and then say something unkind but accurate about cultural pressure. They may wonder why we accepted certain pain as normal, why we pursued certain ideals so aggressively, why we altered ourselves in ways that now seem obvious in motive but strange in execution. And they will be correct. Many mysteries persist, not because they are deep, but because they are early. They exist in the gap between observation and explanation. Once the tools arrive, the mystery collapses into data, and the drama evaporates. This is disappointing for legend, but excellent for understanding. Science does not strip history of meaning. It strips it of unnecessary fear. It removes the supernatural where the biological suffices. It replaces judgment with context. And in doing so, it allows the past to rest without constantly defending itself against modern imagination. The truth arrives late, but it stays. And it is rarely glamorous. It does not whisper secrets. It does not promise transcendence. It simply says, gently, that this body belonged to someone living under different standards, different pressures, and different definitions of what was acceptable, admirable, or necessary. That is not mysterious. It is intimate. As this chapter settles, the strange bodies of history become quieter. They stop performing for curiosity. They stop carrying symbols they never agreed to hold. They return to being what they always were, human forms shaped by culture, care, habit, and time. Science does not erase their story. It finally lets them tell it without distortion. And in the soft hours of late-night history, that is enough. What makes this subject quietly unsettling is not the strangeness of the bodies themselves, but how confidently history spoke about them without listening. A body became a sentence written by others, interpreted, reframed, assigned meaning that had nothing to do with the person living inside it. Once science learned to read the body properly, many accusations dissolved. The monster became a measurement. The anomaly became a pattern. The curse became a condition. And the legend, once stripped of suspense, became surprisingly small. This was disappointing to those who enjoyed mystery. It was liberating to those who had been misunderstood for centuries. One of the subtler shifts science introduced was silence. It stopped asking what the body meant and started asking what the body experienced. This alone changed everything. Suddenly, scars were not symbols. They were records. Deformations were not warnings. They were timelines. The human body, it turned out, is very good at telling the truth when allowed to speak without interpretation layered on top of it. There is gentle irony in how long it took. Humanity examined stars before nerves, cataloged myths before muscles, assigned cosmic meaning to skulls long before considering posture, diet, or repetitive labor. The order was not logical, but it was understandable. Wonder arrived faster than understanding, and so history filled the gaps with imagination, often creative, occasionally cruel, always confident. What modern science does, quietly and without ceremony, is remove that confidence. It replaces certainty with explanation. An explanation, while less exciting, is far kinder. The late arrival of science did not make earlier people foolish. It made them human. They worked with what they had. When tools were blunt, conclusions were dramatic. When tools sharpened, stories softened. Bodies that once carried stigma now carry data. And data, unlike myth, does not judge. There is something oddly comforting in knowing that so many mysteries were simply misunderstandings waiting for better instruments. It suggests that confusion is not failure. It is a stage, one we all pass through, sometimes for centuries at a time. The past believed it was observing meaning. It was observing limits. Future generations will likely say the same about us. This realization does not strip history of dignity. It gives it rest. It allows the strange, the unusual, and the unfamiliar to exist without demanding explanation beyond context. The human body was never trying to send a message. It was adapting, being shaped, being pressured, being cared for, sometimes poorly, sometimes obsessively, sometimes lovingly. And when science finally learned how to listen properly, it did not shout correction. It spoke softly. It said, "This is not a mystery. This is a person." That sentence alone resolves more legends than any dramatic revelation ever could. As this chapter closes, the bodies of the past no longer stand on display. They lie quietly in understanding. No longer symbols, no longer warnings, no longer curiosities, just human forms, shaped by time, interpreted too loudly and finally allowed to be ordinary. And in the stillness of late-night history, that ordinariness feels like relief. When history stops, whispering secrets, and finally admits, was just tired. By the time we reach the end of these stories, something subtle has shifted. The past no longer feels like a gallery of riddles staring back at us, demanding interpretation. It feels quieter, less impressed with itself, almost relieved to stop performing. History, when stripped of mystery, does not collapse. It exhales. Most of what we once called secrets were simply gaps. Gaps in nutrition, gaps in records, gaps in tools, gaps in patience. And into those gaps, humans poured imagination with remarkable enthusiasm, sometimes with poetry, sometimes with terror, often with confidence, wildly disproportionate to the evidence available. There is something almost charming about how hard people tried to make sense of what they did not yet understand. Less charming is how often that effort turned into judgment, the strange body, the unexplained behavior, the missing person, the drowned city, the scribbled symbol. All were pressed into service, as meaning when meaning was not actually required. Science did not arrive to humiliate the past. It arrived late, tired, carrying instruments instead of stories, and quietly said, "This is simpler than we thought." That sentence alone undid centuries of drama. It turns out the dead were rarely sending messages. The living were projecting. When someone vanished, it was usually because war is messy, burial is rushed, and paperwork is fragile. When a city disappeared, it was usually because water does not care about legends. When people behaved strangely together, it was usually because bodies respond to stress long before institutions do. And when a text looked mysterious, unreadable, divine, or dangerous, it was often just badly written notes by someone who never imagined an audience with electricity. This is not a disappointment. It is a correction. We tend to believe mystery adds depth, but often clarity adds weight. The past becomes heavier when we realize how ordinary its suffering was, how familiar its mistakes feel, how recognizable its limits remain. There is mild humor in realizing that humans have always preferred stories where something happens for a reason, weather as punishment, disease as message, difference as warning. Randomness, apparently, has never been comforting. Geology ruined divine floods. Biology ruined curses. Psychology ruined possession. Archaeology ruined Atlantis. Parking lots ruined kings. And yet something survives all of this ruin. What survives is not the mystery, but the people. Once science removes the costume, history becomes populated again. Not by symbols, but by tired travelers, overworked laborers, malnourished children, distracted scribes, bored churchgoers, anxious crowds, ambitious rulers, and bodies doing their best under conditions they did not choose. The past stops being smarter than us. It becomes earlier than us. This is important because believing the past was wiser often leads to the comforting lie that our confusion is new. It is not. We are not uniquely lost. We are repeating a rhythm. The only difference is which tools we currently lack. Future historians will do the same to us. They will look back at our debates, our fears, our obsessions, and gently explain them away with data we do not yet have. They will say, we misunderstood ourselves, that we dramatized what was structural, that we moralized what was biological, that we panicked where patience would have sufficed. and they will be right. That realization is not cynical. It is calming. It suggests that confusion is temporary, that misunderstanding is not failure, but process. That clarity tends to arrive eventually, even if no one is still alive to enjoy being vindicated. Science does not destroy wonder. It relocates it. The wonder moves from, what does this mean, to, how did people live like this at all? From cosmic mystery to human endurance, from spectacle to survival. The past did not need to be mysterious to be impressive. It was impressive simply because people kept going. Late at night, when everything slows, this version of history feels easier to sit with. Less demanding, less theatrical, more honest. There is no final revelation waiting, no hidden key, no grand unifying secret, just a long record of humans reacting to environments, systems, beliefs, and pressures with the limited tools available at the time. They guessed, they improvised, they misunderstood, they adapted. So do we. The most unsettling truth is also the most comforting one. History is not full of warnings meant for us. It is full of people doing their best without knowing how things would turn out. They were not leaving clues. They were leaving traces. And traces, when read carefully, do not accuse. They explain. As this series comes to rest, the past no longer feels like a puzzle box demanding to be solved before sleep. It feels like a long, quiet room where the noise has finally stopped. The stories have been told. The misunderstandings corrected. The drama reduced to scale. What remains is not mystery but familiarity. History is not a ghost story. It is a fatigue story, a survival story, a misunderstanding story. And perhaps that is why it feels unsettling at first. It removes distance. It suggests we are not separate from the past. We are standing directly in its continuation. But once that thought settles, it becomes strangely peaceful. Nothing supernatural is chasing us. Nothing cryptic is watching. Nothing needs to be decoded tonight. The past has already done what it needed to do. It has been lived. All that remains is to let it rest. And so, in the spirit of late night history, we lower the lights, close the books, and leave the mysteries where they belong. Not unresolved, but resolved enough. History does not demand awe. It asks for attention. And sometimes a little mercy. With that, the night grows quieter. The stories soften, and the past, finally understood as human, drifts back into silence, where it can no longer frighten us, only remind us that we have always been like this. Tired, curious, wrong at first, and eventually a little wiser. As the night settles deeper and the stories loosen their grip, there is nothing left to solve. No final clue to uncover, no last mystery hiding just beyond attention. The past, having been examined gently and without theatrics, no longer asks to be understood tonight. It only asks to be left alone. History does not need applause. It does not need belief. It does not even need agreement. It has already endured misunderstanding, exaggeration, and imagination more energetic than accurate. What it appreciates most, it turns out, is quiet. Quiet attention. quiet correction, quiet acceptance that most things were never mysterious, only human. If there is humor lingering here, it is soft and forgiving. Humanity spent centuries turning exhaustion into legend, error into symbolism, and inconvenience into cosmic meaning. And then science arrived, late and unromantic, carrying charts and dates and saying, almost apologetically, "It was never that deep." That sentence does not diminish the past. It returns it to scale. And scale matters, especially at night, when the mind prefers not to carry unnecessary weight into sleep. What we leave behind now is not a collection of solved riddles, but a calmer relationship with history itself. One that does not demand awe or fear. One that allows us to see people where we once saw symbols, and circumstances where we once imagined intention. That shift is enough. Thank you for staying here quietly until the end, for listening without urgency, for letting the stories slow down instead of insisting they perform. Your attention, given this gently, is rare, and history responds well to rare things. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the night has reached for you, this is a good place to stop thinking. The past will not move while you rest. It has already waited centuries, so take a breath. Let the details fade. Let the noise thin out. Nothing more is required tonight. Good night. Sleep well. And when you return, history will still be here. Calm, ordinary, and no longer asking to be solved.